you're just coming in, we're asking everybody to sit in the first 3 tables if you can. We're going to have a small group, so that's going to let us have a little bit more discussion and kind of talk a little bit more about this. Thank y'all so much. Appreciate y'all as you're moving forward. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit. Tammy's going to come up here in a moment and introduce our speaker for us today. But I wanted to tell you, several of you I think know what the Regional Autism Network does, but some of you may not. So I wanted to let you know what resources are going to be on the table back there. I want you to feel free to swing by during your break, talk to us, pick some things up. So the Regional Autism Network, we have 5 locations throughout the state of Alabama. So if you work with someone on the spectrum or with a family member and they have questions, if they just want to know general information, if they want to know about general resources, and maybe you don't have time to talk to them for a long time, you can give them a copy of our resource pack. It's going to have a lot of general information in here about autism. Now, it may have things that they don't need, so we're going to have things like child services, services for very little ones under 3, services for adults. But there's going to be a lot of information in there. They can kind of pick and choose what they like. And then it's got our contact information in here. And if they will call us and kind of tell us a little bit about their story, we can kind of help direct them to resources in the area. Or if they have enough resources to, say, travel or drive to another major city like Birmingham, Huntsville, Mobile, something like that, we can connect them with the directors in those locations so that they can find resources in those areas. So what a lot of pediatricians now are giving this out, some doctors, because sometimes people don't have time to sit and listen to someone's full story and really give them suggestions. So what the pediatricians are doing is, they're saying something like, I hear your concerns. There's nothing that I can do right now to diagnose your child, but let me give you this folder. It's some information, and give them a call and just talk through what's going on. So what the pediatricians are doing is I drop them off packs of about 15 of these folders. This is what our grant funds us, is to put this information together. On the last one, they write, call them for more. So if you all want to stop and pick up, I might have enough for everybody to take home like 5 today. Put that on the last one, and then call us, and we'll mail you all another set of 20 packets. We only get to see people when we go out to resource fairs or things like that, so you all are seeing a lot more families than us. This is a way for us to kind of spread our reach, and hopefully it also helps out a lot more people. We also have a lot of books. We have behavior solutions for the inclusive classroom and the home and community. We're happy to send these to you. Again, this is what our grant pays for. You all can give them out to families. The great thing about this is in the table of contents, it lists a lot of behaviors that are, kind of specific to people with autism. Hand flapping, clothing issues, button issues, things like that. So what I found a lot of parents like to do, it's maybe like a page of describing the behavior and a couple of things that might work for it. So it's great for parents to read, but then also for them to take a picture of like a page or 2 and send it to Sunday school teachers, daycare workers, aunts and uncles, and say, hey, my kid's not weird. This is totally normal. Here, read like a little page on this. This is normal for my kid. So I think this is a great resource for parents, but then also because it's so easy to share with others. We have this book. This is more, I tend to only give this out to parents that have spent a little bit more time with us. It's a very dense read. You guys I think would love to have a copy of this. This is more for people on the spectrum once they hit puberty. It's life skills. It'll talk about things like driving, financial independence, going through puberty, things like that. So all these things are going to happen. So we've got that book. We have a few of these. They quit printing these, but if you all want one of these for like your offices or something, Sesame Street has introduced a character with autism called Julia. And so this book goes through, and it is a little bit about, what it is like being friends with a person with autism. We also have the resource folder, and this is a book called 10 Things Your Child with Autism Wishes You Knew in Spanish. So we have our resources in Spanish, and I've worked with some people, the Hispanic Coalition here in town, and our Spanish folder is much slimmer, but what my parents have told me is they want everything in this book to be in Spanish, because it's sometimes intimidating for some of their parents to get things in English. The only thing that I double up in here is there's a list of common terms on the spectrum, and for the Spanish folders, I'll put that in there in English and Spanish, so they can kind of compare the terms. So we'll have all those back on the table. We also have a handy-dandy shopping bag. for you to pick up and put all your resources in. So swing back there during breaks and stuff and chat with us, and we'll give you some stuff to take home. And now, Tammy Barkey, and thank you all for moving up. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for moving up. I want to say good morning and welcome. I'm Tammy Barkey. I'm the Family Navigator for the University of Alabama Regional Autism Network. And just to clarify, the Alabama Department of Mental Health region is far more than just Tuscaloosa. So my region runs almost all the way up to Huntsville, goes all the way down to Mobile, and heads over towards Birmingham as well. So it encompasses a very large region, and I worked with families and individuals with autism in our area. The Regional Autism Network has staff across the state that serve to assist individuals and their caregivers connect with resources and services. Contact information for RAN is on the flyer accessed through the QR code on the inside of your spiral notebook. So you may flip that over and you see a QR code in there. You scan that and that'll take you to the flyer that lists the regional autism networks across the state. The RAN and the Alabama Interagency Autism Coordinating Council funded this workshop, which will be presented in 4 more locations throughout this summer and fall. Please encourage your colleagues across the state to register for one of these other locations. I would like to thank Emily Townsend and Amanda Bergeron and their team at UA College of Continuing Studies for planning and preparing the workshop locations and registration for all of these sessions. Adapting evidence-based psychology for autistic individuals will be presented by Dr. Sarah Ryan. Dr. Ryan completed her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa in 2011. In 2011, she was hired to run the University of Alabama ASD College Transition and Support Program. Then from 2013 to 2018, she served as the Administrative Director of Autism Services at the University of Alabama. In that role, she served as the primary psychologist and director of the UA ACTS program, a college support program for students with autism, and the primary psychologist and director of the ASD Clinic, a diagnostic and intervention clinic for individuals from birth across the lifespan. In January 2017, Dr. Ryan accepted a position as the clinical psychologist at UAB Civitan Sparks, where she conducted assessments and intervention, assessments and intervention with children suspected of having ASD diagnosis as a part of an interdisciplinary team. Dr. Ryan served as a governor's appointee on the Alabama Interagency Autism Coordinating Council from 2011 to 2017 and remains active in the state level policy development. Please welcome our presenter today, Dr. Sarah Ryan.
Can everyone hear me okay? So we are going to use the microphone because they are going to record this. And so just to make sure that the sound gets picked up, we're going to use the microphone just in case. And so if you ask questions, which I want to encourage you to do, that's why we had people move to the front, I may repeat those so that the microphone can pick them up. So, as she said, I've worked with adolescents and adults with autism for a while. That is my restricted interest. And so I don't get to do it as much at Sparks clinics, but I'm sort of carving out an area there where I can. So I do have some therapy clients that I see now that are adults, and I plan to continue that. So that said, I am by no means the expert. So everybody here has experiences. Everybody here has worked with clients in a variety of roles, some of whom may have had autism. And so my hope is that there are some of you here that this is a new topic and some of you here that may have had some training. And so this may be in some areas a review and in some areas some new information. So the obligatory disclosures, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm not planning on talking about anything that I have a commercial interest in. So my plan for this morning may be ambitious, but we'll see. To identify the key features of autism and how they present in adolescents and adults, especially those with better cognitive functioning, at least as we can measure it. There are some caveats to that our tests may not be great at measuring cognitive functioning in this group, and so those on the spectrum have asked that we assume better intelligence regardless of what the IQ tests say. So that we will look at some of the comorbid features or some of the differences in how they may process information that can contribute to symptoms of autism, but also that can contribute to symptoms that you may be seeing in practice, so anxiety, depression, anger management, things like that. And then we also will look at, so given what we know about autism, what we know about these things that go along with autism, how do we then adapt what we're doing to work for autistic adults? So Stephen Shore said, if you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism, meaning that there is a variety of presentations. So we talk about symptoms and we talk about clusters of symptoms, but what that looks like may be different from one person to another. And so some of these things you may be tweaking different strategies, and what works with one patient may not work with another. Not every patient has every symptom, and so they may have some strengths in areas that we don't always see in autistic individuals. And so just kind of keeping that in mind. The other thing I do want to encourage is I'm going to have several breaks for questions, but I do want to encourage, if you have questions that come up, feel free to raise your hand and ask. I want to make sure that we're tailoring this to the direction that this group needs, because each of these 5 workshops is going to have a slightly different makeup of providers that are attending, and so I want to make sure that we can shape it in a way that is most meaningful for you guys. So some notes on terminology. When I was in grad school and when I was sort of early in my career, we were very much encouraged to use person-first language. So a person with autism, or a person with anxiety, or a person with ADHD. But there's been a recent movement among self-advocates that they would rather be referred to as autistic individuals. And so there's this difference or sort of disparity in the neurodiversity movement that says this is who we are autistic adults, versus those of us who are trying to be respectful and say that, you know, this is not all that you are. And so it kind of goes against everything that I was taught to say autistic adults, but I had one of our college students, even just saying like students on the spectrum, he felt like I was avoiding the term autism, and it was very offensive to him. And so I was like, okay, well, I will sort of rethink how I refer to this population. So you may see me use both of those things interchangeably, because I'm trying to incorporate the communities, the self-advocate community's preferences into how I refer to them. They should get to choose how we refer to them. And so in order to be respectful, I will probably end up switching back and forth between the two and using the two interchangeably. When you're working with patients, some of them may very much embrace their diagnosis, and you know, I had one student tell me that if there was an autism pride parade, he'd be walking down the center of the street with his autism pride shirt on. I had other students who would walk 10 feet behind me anywhere we went on campus, because they assumed everybody on campus knew I was the autism person. And they didn't want anybody to know. So it's highly variable. And so I would go with whatever it is that your patients would like for you to use. So, what is autism? How many of you, I assume if you're here, you have at least some interest in this area. How many of you currently have patients on the spectrum that you're working with? Okay. How many of you had formal training in school on autism? Good. Perfect. That's perfect. So for some of you, this may be a review. For some of you, this is new. And that's really my goal, is to bring all of us up to the same level of understanding of autism, at least as close as we can get in 4 hours. I've taught entire semesters worth of classes on this, and so there is a lot of information here. But I'm glad that you're here if you know nothing about autism. That is a good thing, so thank you for coming. So what is autism? So some of the myths associated with autism. Autistic adults don't make eye contact. That's sometimes true, sometimes not. That they don't want or have friends, also. Sometimes true, sometimes not. So I did some diagnostic evaluations, mostly here at UA when I was here for adults. A lot of times it was parents of children I had diagnosed. And they would be married. They'd come in. One of them, he was fun. He was like, "Don't tell my wife, but I think I tricked her because I took a dating class, and then I used all those skills to get her to go out with me, and I don't think that that's exactly what she was expecting." So it's like, well, fine, whatever, you do you. But he was married. One of my current clients has a teenage daughter. And has been married, has been in relationships. That they lack empathy. This one actually really bothers some of our students. So one of our students would tell me that he hated the Big Bang Theory because Sheldon, who is stereotypically autistic in almost too close of a diagnostic way. I mean, he follows the diagnostic criteria pretty closely. They feel like he lacks empathy, that he doesn't care how what he does affects other people. And it really bothered some of our students because they do care. They may not be able to recognize it, but they do care. And that really bothered him because he didn't want other people to assume that they just plow over other people's feelings without caring. And that they're always aloof. They may actually seem really outgoing. So that's one of the things that, I'll hear people say, some of the things I've heard that providers have told their patients. You did well in school, so you couldn't have autism. You have friends, so you couldn't have autism. You're too social, especially with girls, so you couldn't have autism. You really want to get out there and make friends, so you couldn't have autism. You made eye contact with me, so you couldn't have autism. Not true. None of those things are true. So wanted to start by dispelling some of those myths that we hear. So the most recent prevalence data that was released by the CDC is 1 in 36. So this has significantly changed. If you look from 2000 to this most recent data, which is based on, so the data was released in 2023. This is based on 8-year-olds with a diagnosis. Alabama actually used to participate in a collection of this data. And sadly, our rates were much lower, not because we don't have kids with autism, but because we can't count them. And the diagnosis is so delayed for many of them. So that's our current prevalence. Why do you think the curve looks like this? Or the line? It's not really a curve. People seeking diagnosis, knowledge, earlier detection. So we're more aware. We're getting better at spotting it and we're sending kids for evaluation. That doesn't mean that when we identify this kid needs an evaluation, they're going to get it anytime soon, sadly. So a lot of the wait lists in this state, I know at Sparks, we have about a 9 to 12 month wait list. When I was here at the clinic, we had a very similar wait list. So the other thing that this doesn't show is back in 2000, the overlap with autism and intellectual disabilities was about 90%. And so now it's dropped closer to 40%. And again, that assumes that we're measuring intelligence accurately, which is a big assumption in this population, because if you're familiar with IQ tests, they assume, especially in kids, some level of imitation. Play is a big part of how we measure cognitive functioning in little kids. And so I've had 2 or 3-year-olds who come in and their cognitive testing tells me they're at the level of a 9-month-old, but they're sitting there on their dad's cell phone watching a video that they pulled up on YouTube, and then they're scrolling back to the part that they want, and then when an ad comes up, they get out of the ad and back into the video. I don't know how to get out of an ad on YouTube. So are they really at the level of a 9-month-old? Probably not. We just don't have a great way of measuring that. And that is one thing to keep in mind when you're working with this group is one of the things that almost universally when I was doing IQ testing in adults with autism is you come in, you interact with them, and you feel like they are cognitively delayed. You just kind of get that sense. But you do IQ testing on them, and they're not actually as delayed as you think they are. And it's because a lot of the ways that we measure whether or not somebody is delayed cognitively is because we're watching how they respond to us, their nonverbal cues to us that they're understanding. So like I'm watching you guys now to see if you're understanding, and you're nodding your head, and you might have a slight raise of the eyebrow, or you might smile subtly. If they don't show those things, then we tend to assume that they don't understand what we're saying. If they're not making eye contact, we tend to assume that they don't understand what we're saying. But that's not true. And so it may feel like interacting with somebody who's cognitively delayed when really they're not. And so even the nonverbal autistic adults have asked us to assume average or close to average cognitive ability. It is 4-to-1 male to female. Why? But it is not just a male disorder. That is a common misconception. So there's several reasons this might be. So one, Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, who developed the criteria for Asperger's and autism, based it on how it presented in boys. And there is now some evidence that says that when it's present in girls, it may look different. So girls may be able to mimic what's going on around them and fit in socially, but not really understand why what they're doing works. And so one of the adults I tested talked about it like it was having masks or costumes that she would go to the closet in the morning and put on based on what she needed to do for the day. And if she didn't know what to expect, that was very anxiety-provoking because now she doesn't know how she is supposed to act. She doesn't have a mask or a script in her head for how that's supposed to go. And so it's not unusual. It's actually, there's a lot of research that says that when girls have it, they tend to be diagnosed later in life. So I diagnosed a 44-year-old recently because I diagnosed her daughter. I had a dad come in. I diagnosed both of his sons. He came in. He's like, I'm not sure if I'm autistic or just an asshole. Well, I mean, but so a lot of people with autism that are milder, especially girls, tend to be diagnosed later in life. And so some of these people, like that dad who he'd been born more recently, we might have caught earlier, are being caught later in life. So there's also some evidence that there's some genetic differences. So the X chromosome has been linked in some individuals with autism, and there's some differences on the X chromosome that can predict autism or can be correlated with autism. And so that might be why it's more common in males, because males only have one, whereas females have two X's. And so there's also some evidence that if you have a girl in the family who has autism, that the genetic loading in the family may be higher. So it might be more likely that siblings have it than if you have a male sibling in terms of the relationship between likelihood of siblings having autism. The other caveat to this is that it is actually more common for autistic adults or autistic individuals in general to identify as LGBTQ. So they may actually identify as non-binary. They may be more gender non-conforming than others. And so I get calls from groups like Magic City Acceptance Center and things like that that say, oh, you know, I think a large percentage of our population is either diagnosed or undiagnosed with autism. And there's some research to support that the rates of LGBTQ identification in this group are higher. So we can try to dichotomize gender in this 4-to-1 male to female ratio, but that may be sort of a false dichotomy in some ways, or false categorization. So keep in mind that they may not identify with their biological sex at birth. What causes autism? I can tell you it's not vaccines. Yes, I've heard that. I've also heard that apple seeds can cure it, which I don't recommend because they're actually poisonous, so don't do that. There's a lot of misinformation out there, leaky gut syndrome, vaccinations, and we can get into a whole discussion about how those things started. Our best understanding is that there are some genetic markers that you can sometimes see. So you can sometimes see family members, as I mentioned, who have it. So if you have identical twins, if one has it, there's a 90% chance that other one's going to have it. If you have one child in your family on the spectrum, there's about a 20% chance that other children will be on the spectrum. And I've seen families where all 3 kids have it. You know, we used to talk about the broader autism phenotype a lot. So you see kids with autism and you can spot symptoms, whether they're rise to the level of a diagnosis or not. You can spot symptoms sometimes in caregivers or biological relatives. So you may see language delays in other family members. You may see anxiety or ADHD or learning differences in other family members, even if they don't necessarily have autism. And so our best understanding is that, and in about 15 to 20% of people tested, they can identify some chromosomal difference. So sometimes that gets sort of just tweaked when the DNA gets put together. Sometimes it's inherited, but there's some evidence for some genetic underlying causes that then trigger, and the environment may play a role in triggering those genetics. We don't totally understand that, but that those genetics then trigger differences in how the brain develops and how the brain functions. So parts of their brain, or parts of our brains that we use for learning things without realizing we're learning, which we'll talk about later, they may have to use other parts of their brain to do the same thing. So they've done a lot of studies in terms of differences in connectivity through the brain, and we won't get into all that, but there's lots of research out there. And then that changes how they process what's going on around them, which is sort of the middle part of our discussion today. are those differences in how they process that can both contribute to their symptoms of autism, but that can also contribute to or affect their ability to participate in interventions. And then that results in what we behaviorally see as autism. So there's no test that we can say medically, conclusively, yep, that's autism, nope, that's not. Because it's entirely based on behavioral observations right now. So what do those behavioral observations look like? So this is based on the DSM-5. So for DSM-5, we're looking at autism. We're looking at symptoms in two different areas. So one is social communication, and one is any patterns in their behaviors or interests that may look different from others their age or at their developmental level. So the first area, that's social communication. So what we typically think of in really young kids is not talking, or not showing things that interest them to other people, not sharing enjoyment in things with other people. But in adults, it may not look like that exactly. So adults, we look a lot when we're trying to figure out if someone has autism, we look a lot at their conversations. So, and a lot of times you get kind of two polar opposites. So one, you ask a question and you get just enough to answer the question. So I might ask, so do you have pets? Yes. Okay. So then you have to ask more questions. The flip side to that is I may say, do you have pets? Yes, I have a German Shepherd dog. Did you know that the German Shepherd dog was, and then I get a lesson on German Shepherds. And I didn't ask about that. I just said, do you have a dog? And so you may get some combination of those things. We also look at how they respond to comments and conversations. So they may be fine with questions, but you may end up feeling like either you're interviewing them or they're interviewing you, because when it comes to making a comment, so let's say I then said, yeah, I have 2 dogs. Crickets. Because it's not a question. We get this a lot. Actually, text message is really bad for this, because like I'll have partners who come in, and the neurotypical partners, like I send him text messages and he doesn't respond. And he's like, well, there wasn't a question. And so there was no direct question, so there was no recognition that we needed to respond. And she's like, he's avoiding me and he doesn't want to talk about it. And he's like, but you didn't ask me a question. So that back and forth in the recognition of that online communication. So just this week I had a conversation with an adult client because, one, how frequently they should respond in online communication. And so she had been talking online with somebody and he had offered information, I think, about his cat. And she's like, I don't know what to say now. And so we had to talk through, okay, well, what could you say? So you could offer information about yourself that's related to cats, or you could make a comment about what he's told you related to cats. You could tie it back to something you talked about earlier related to cats. But she, just based on the comments that he had made, wasn't sure what to do, what to say. So that conversation, comforting others. It's not, so they may not know what to do if somebody's upset, or if somebody, so they may think, oh, I need to fix this. They're asking me to fix this. And this is not unique to autism. I'm sure married couples all over the place have had this conversation. But when people vent, or when people are upset, it's not always about seeking somebody to fix it. And this group may not always know how to just let the person be upset, or what to say, or what this person is seeking in terms of comfort. And so that will obviously affect relationships. So that social back and forth is the first. The second is nonverbal communication. And this is where you get eye contact. Eye contact is sort of the universally understood symptom of autism, but it isn't universally a problem for people with autism, especially when you get into those who may have sort of higher cognitive functioning, who may be navigating their environment a little bit better. They may make eye contact. Now, sometimes it may be unusually intense, or it may be kind of fleeting at times, but they may make eye contact. It may be appropriate eye contact, especially, again, when you get into adults. They've learned, so some of them tell me that they'll look at foreheads instead, or they'll look past. So I've had other people that will like look past. Some of them will tell you it's uncomfortable. Some of them will tell you that they've just learned to do it. Some of the kids I've diagnosed, it wasn't really a problem, because this category includes a lot of aspects of nonverbal communication, not just eye contact. So this includes use of gestures. I talk with my hands. If it's distracting, I'm sorry. But I use a lot of gestures, emphatic gestures when I talk. People with autism may not use as many gestures to communicate. They may not have as many facial expressions, which gets back into some of the assumptions we make about whether or not they understand what's going on or what we're talking about. So they may have very flat affect, but they're processing. They may not be making eye contact, and you don't think, and they may have very flat affect, and you may think they're not paying attention. But then the second you say something that they want to challenge, or that, you know, catches you realize that they are, in fact, paying attention. So all of the ways that you use to judge what they're thinking may not apply, which gets tricky in a therapeutic setting, because we're trying to match behavior, we're trying to gauge buy-in, we're trying to sort of figure out where our clients are at, and that can be tricky if their nonverbal communication doesn't match what we've all been sort of processed or ingrained to assume. And then the other thing here is their ability to understand other people's nonverbal communication. This is where a lot of the adults will get stuck. So they may have worked through the eye contact issues, they may use gestures, their facial expressions may be reasonably appropriate, but then their ability to recognize other people's nonverbal communication may be lacking. So if you want to get out of a session by checking your watch, that is not going to work. I have literally had to get up from behind my desk and walk out of my office to end a session. I had a student, and their recognition that, you know what, other people can tell what I'm thinking based on how I'm acting is also different. So I had a student come in one day. He's got probably the flattest affect I've seen in an adult in a very long time. He comes stomping up the stairs. He comes to the room across from my office, and he drops his book bag, and he comes out. We'll call him John. It's like, so John, are you upset about something? And he stops. How did you know? Well, it was just a guess. And so we had to have a conversation about how I can read his affect based on his nonverbal cues. Because the idea that, he can't do that. So the idea that other people can do that for him was kind of foreign. So the other thing that we look at is relationships and creativity. So some of the adults, one of the tests that we give to diagnose autism, we give them a bag of about 7 or 8 items, and we have them pick 5 and create a story. And this is a challenge, because that level of creativity or abstractness is difficult. So my favorite recently was, I had a kid teenager, and he looked at it, he's like, it is a red cube approximately 1 inch by 1 inch. It is a silver, and he just labeled the physical property. Physics was his restricted interest, and he just labeled the physical properties. And when it was clear, we're like, well, can you tell us a story? Can you use them to make a story? He went back through. This is a red cube. And so finally I stopped the grad student. I was like, I think we've got what we need to see. Because that level of creativity was difficult. Not to say they can't be creative. So I had a student who was sitting in my office, and he very much was he was writing a lot of fiction, historical fiction. So history was his restricted interest. And so he was telling me all about this series of historical fiction that he was going to write. And at the time, my lunch had just gotten delivered. I was like, all right, well, John, I'm going to eat lunch, and, so that we need to end this, because he was just sitting there talking. And he's like, oh, I've watched you eat before. I was like, okay, yeah, fine, keep talking. And he was telling me all about this historical fiction, and so I was eating my lunch, and he told me, and it was really creative, but it was in his restricted interest. So that level of abstractness, though, also gets into being able to envision. It takes some level of creativity to envision what might happen in the future. So what does it look like to get a job in computer programming? What does it look like to get a job as a veterinarian? If you can't think abstractly and creatively, you're going to struggle with that. The other thing in this category that we look at is understanding of relationships. So the idea that they don't want them is a myth. Some of them don't. So some of them we'd be like, well, why don't you invite your roommate to the game with you this weekend? And they'd be like, why? I'm there to watch the game. The roommate's just going to get in the way. I go, okay, fine. Whatever works for you. Some of them really want friendships. So I had a student call me. We had an emergency cell phone that I carried with me 24/7. I will never do that again. He called me at 1 a.m. and it was his first weekend on campus as a freshman. And he said, it's my first weekend here, and I don't have a girlfriend yet. I would be concerned if you did. And so we had to talk about how this idea that he had gotten this idea that if he came to college, he would get a girlfriend, because that's what all the shows say. He had this idea that if you're not eating every meal with somebody, then you're weird. You are socially rejected. Not true. Nobody eats every meal with somebody unless even if you're married and living in the same house. And so that kind of misconception drives some of the things that you may be seeing in treatment. So if you don't understand what those social rules actually look like or how those relationships are built, then you may develop a lot of low self-esteem, internalized, sort of self-deprecating statements. You may have a lot of anxiety. You may have a lot of depression, because what you think you're supposed to be doing is not what's happening. And what you think you're supposed to be doing socially is not realistic. So some of the students that I worked with don't want friends, and their parents would come in and say, well, I think he needs to make friends. I'm like, well, I think he needs the social skills to meet his own goals. And that's probably job related. I think he needs the social skills to function in a job. If he doesn't want friends, that's fine with me. So we all assume that relationships are going to add value to somebody or to somebody's life. And that is a neurotypical assumption. That is our goal. That is not necessarily their goal. But if it is their goal, then we need to help them meet it. So I had another student who, he's my favorite example of sort of skewed understanding of social relationships. So at one point, he thought he was dating the Hooters waitress because she was nice to him. And so we had to have a conversation about, she's going to be nice to you because it's part of her job and it increases her tip. But it doesn't mean that she's romantically interested in you. It doesn't mean she's not. But it doesn't guarantee that she's romantically interested in you. He and I also would frequently debate. He really wanted to get married, but was convinced that marriage was not a social interaction, didn't involve social interaction. And so I was like, well, what do you want in that marriage. And he's like, I want to sit and read my poetry, and I want her to sit, and at the time the girl he was interested in liked to crochet. I want her to sit and crochet. It's like, well, are you going to talk to each other? It's like, no. He had some interesting rules, too, about things that a wife couldn't do for him that a friend could, like borrow his car. I don't know where some of these things came from. He also, he had some, his idea of how you get a girlfriend was very much courting. And so we had to have discussions about how you don't ask somebody's parents to date them if you haven't had that discussion with them. And just because people didn't make a relationship on Facebook or official on Facebook doesn't mean the relationship hasn't been going on for a while. So he would get blocked on a regular basis on Facebook because he would make comments like, you haven't known that person long enough to be engaged. I'm like, you don't know how long they've known them. He's like, but they didn't mention them on Facebook. I'm like, no, it doesn't matter. But just because he couldn't see their relationship play out over time, he assumed that it didn't exist except for what he saw. Had another student, in terms of developing friendships, I asked him if he had made friends since he'd been on campus. He said, yeah, absolutely. I was like, well, what are their names? I don't know. Okay, well, how do you know them? Well, I say hi to them when I get on the bus in the morning to come to campus. Oh, okay. Well, what do they like? What do they like to do? I don't know. What are their interests? Do you have anything in common? I don't know. And for them, that was actually about all they wanted. Like, okay, well, you may view that as a friendship, they may not. And so my goal was not to sort of burst their bubble in terms of that's not a friendship, that's what you want in a relationship. The same thing with this student who was convinced that marriage is not a social interaction. It's like, okay, if that's what you want, that's fine, but know that your partner may have different expectations. So he did end up dating, and his girlfriend at the time would text him in the evenings to say goodnight, and he came in complaining. He's like, it's too much. Why does she do that? Like, she just texts me every night to say, it's too much interaction. I was like, well, okay. So we had to discuss that your expectations may not match their expectations, and that's a discussion you're going to have. And if you want a relationship that is less social, you may want to consider dating somebody else with similar social sort of preferences to you, somebody else who may be autistic. He's like, but then I increase the chance of passing my autism on to my children, and I don't want to do that. It's like, okay, so that is a consideration. And so the relationship aspect, dating in general, is awkward regardless. But for this group, they're at risk for being considered stalkers. So this student, he had been asked not to, one of my students had been asked not to talk to somebody that he had made feel uncomfortable after she started dating somebody. And he had been asked not to talk to her anymore. She had asked him, the leader of the organization where they met had asked him, her birthday rolls around, and he's like, but it's her birthday. It would be rude not to get her a present. Because in his mind, when it's somebody's birthday, you have to get them a present. And if you don't, then that's rude because you're not acknowledging their birthday. And so we had to have a conversation about how it's also rude not to respect what they've asked you to do, which is not to talk to them. So I did talk him out of getting her a birthday present. But it's not, there was nothing malicious. He truly was coming from a good place. But the idea that she didn't want him talking to her was sort of baffling to him. And so this group is at risk for being accused of stalking. So the second category we look at are any differences in behaviors or interests. So this is the 4 different categories that we look for. They only have to have symptoms in 2 of these. So the first is the repetitive play, language, motor movements. A lot of this fades over time. We call these lower order, meaning that they tend to be more common in younger children or those who may not have average cognitive functioning. And so, but you will still occasionally see these. So we had a student, I always knew when he was in the room above my office because he would sway back and forth. It was a very old building, and so the floor would creak. It's still standing, which amazes me. We had a student who would use words, neologisms, so words he had made up. But in general, in adolescents and adults that are probably going to be seeking therapy, this is going to be less frequent. Although I will say that one of my current adult patients has said that sometimes she resorts to repeating phrases verbatim that she's heard because she doesn't know what else to say. And so then she feels guilty because she's like, it was a lie. It's not true, but I didn't know what else to say, and I'd heard somebody else say this, and so I just said it. And so for her, the repetitive language serves a function as a place, sort of a placeholder when she doesn't know what else to do. And in many kids, you can kind of see that happen with repetitive language. So I'll have teachers say, oh, well, he's mocking me. I asked him a question, and he just repeated the question. I'm like, he's not mocking you. He doesn't know what to say. So he's just going to repeat you. This one, these 2 right here are where you're going to see probably more difficulty. So the compulsive tendencies, needing things to be done in a certain way or a certain order. I had a student call me because it was Saturday in the fall. He had gone to Publix, and he's like, why are the roads blocked? It's like, well, there's a football game. It's like, why are we blocking all the roads for one sporting event? It's like, fair, okay. He's like, now I can't get back to my apartment because the route that he used to get to and from his apartment was no longer going to work. And he was in the middle of a panic attack. So 1, we started prepping him for football weekends ahead of time. This was a failure on our part. And 2, I had to walk him through an alternate route to get home, which was not difficult. But once his expected route wasn't an option, all bets were off. Same student, when he was living on campus, called me one day and he said, can't you just get me a reserved spot in the parking deck? It's like, man, if I could, I would have one. I wish I had the kind of power you people think I do. And so he needed that consistency. And when he couldn't get it, it would trigger a lot of anxiety. Students who a professor would move a quiz later, not earlier, later. The rest of the class is like, oh, thank God. And our student is like, but like, it's supposed to be today. And so then the quiz gets moved, and it includes material that was covered between the time it should have been and the time that it actually was offered. And so now they're mad because it's wrong. I had a student come in and sit in my office and she was like, my professor has canceled class 3 times already this semester. I'd be like, heck yeah. Sweet. Yeah, break. She's like, I can't get into a routine. Like, okay, fair enough. And so those kinds of things, and it can be subtle. So they did construction on the road in front of our building. So maybe 10 yards were fenced in front of our building. Students had gotten used to crossing the street in front of our building. And so I had a student come in and he was like, I'm going to have to rethink my entire route here. I was like, well, why don't you just walk down to the end of this street right here and then cross right there and then come up at the crosswalk. He's like, oh, okay, that'll work. But he was so anxious about this change that he couldn't problem solve that. And so that can cause some challenges in a work setting. This can cause a lot of anxiety around daily tasks. Big Bang Theory is a perfect example of this. Sheldon has his spot on the couch. And he doesn't want anybody else sitting there because that's where he needs to sit, because it, sensory-wise, is where he wants to sit. Perspective-wise, he doesn't have to change his perspective. I had a student who had a similar thing. He had a spot on the couch at his house because he knew that there were young kids that were running around in diapers, and he didn't want to sit anywhere that they might have sat on the couch. It's like, well, I hate to break it to you, bud, but... and so that can cause a lot of problems. This one here, restricted interests, can also cause a lot of problems. So this is any interest that may be either typical in focus but intense, or maybe kind of an unusual thing to be focused on. So in little kids, not unusual for little kids to be interested in trains. But when you have a 3-year-old who's spending 5 hours in the hobby shop staring at schematics of steam engines, that's different. Not a bad thing necessarily. It might mean they're really good at that, but it's different. We've had students who, I was doing an evaluation with an elementary school kid, and I was like, what do you like to do for fun? He was like, oh, I like to go places. Well, where do you like to go? Office Depot. Okay. Well, what do you do at Office Depot? I like to stare at the desks. And his mom's like, you don't understand. His room looks like an office supply store. Okay, well, what else do you do at Office Depot? He's like, I stare at the highlighters. It's like, okay. I like office supplies too, but that's going to be hard for a 7-year-old to share that interest. It's like, well, where else do you like to go? Staples. I get it. I get it. As adults, this may be, so we had students whose restricted interest was Disney movies. My Little Pony. We've had students whose restricted interest was World War II ammunition. And if you get excited or upset and start monologuing about ammunition, that makes people anxious. And so we've had students whose restricted interest was art. Good one, especially if you're an art major. Whose restricted interest was math. We had a student who, if you had ever been in our building, it was really old. It was a historic nursing building. It was built before they had codes for, width and, stairs and all that stuff. We had a student who could walk up and down our stairs, who could walk from his dorm room to the vending machine and back, all on his laptop, looking at math equations. And his restricted interest was math, and he recognized that he just needed to go get a degree in math and go become a math professor where he could talk to people about math all day and research whatever you research in math. And so I was like, yeah, fair enough. Okay. He had been admitted to MIT. He couldn't function, not because of the academics, because of the social and some of the other comorbid things that go along with it. So we had students whose restricted interest was fan fiction. So we had a student who got into a habit of what I call serial napping. So instead of sleeping through the night and getting up, or sleeping through the day and getting up at night, whatever works with your schedule, he would read fan fiction until he was so tired that he couldn't function. He would sleep for a few hours, sometimes in the middle of a cafeteria. He would get back up and he would read more fan fiction. Now, this whole time, he's got classes going too. And so that became very difficult to maintain. And it had a really significant impact on his functioning. So it can impact functioning at work, it can impact functioning in classes, it can impact family functioning. So parents who are like, my kid never leaves their room. And I realize that's not entirely unusual. It's not unique to autism. Teenagers generally may do that. But spending so much time engaged in a restricted interest that it begins to impact other areas of functioning. They also, this may interfere socially. So if all they can talk about is this restricted interest, then it's harder to make friends. So you can find a group of people that may have similar interests, but you're going to have to eventually talk about things outside of that interest. Yes?
Do you find that the restricted interests stay consistent for
No.
most of their lives, or they just are one?
They can change. We usually look for them to stay consistent. For us to count it, like in a diagnostic way, we expect it to stay consistent for a few months. I've seen them last years, and I've seen them last a year and then shift. Like my office supply kid probably isn't interested in office supplies anymore. It might be Minecraft now, or Roblox, or, you know. It may start as Thomas and Paw Patrol and end up as calculus. So it tends to shift with their developmental levels. Yeah.
Do you see less of a shift that the individuals have co-occurring maybe?
Actually, I don't know. It's a good question. Clinically, I don't know that I've seen that. I don't know if there's research on that.
What did you say?
So she asked if you see a shift or less of a shift in individuals who also have an intellectual disability. And I don't know that that actually holds true. It probably depends on the degree of the intellectual disability and what it is. So those with intellectual disabilities, you do see more of the repetitive tendencies and fewer of the restricted interests. So these are considered higher order, meaning they're more common in those who are older or who have higher cognitive functioning. And so in some really young kids or somebody with an intellectual disability, you may not see what we would consider a true restricted interest at all. You may just see more repetitive. So like they have to always seek out spoons and forks to carry. So it's a form of repetitive play, but could look like a restricted interest too. And then this area, so sensory. This is one that we probably don't pay enough attention to. In fact, under the previous DSM criteria, sensory aversions weren't even considered, which in hindsight is kind of shocking because that's pretty impactful. So I was in a meeting with a student. We were meeting with disability services, and there were several of us around a desk. And at some point, 45 minutes in, now this student, most people would interact with her and not realize she had autism. But at some point, about 45 minutes in, she's like, I haven't heard a thing you said. All I've heard is the clock ticking on the wall. I was sitting next to the clock, and until she pointed it out, I didn't notice it. And so for her, it was impossible to filter that out. And so that happens not just with things like ADHD, but also definitely with autism, and it can be more impactful. So some of our college students can't wear blue jeans or denim because it's scratchy. They may avoid showers because the sensation of water on their heads. Some of them have told me that rain hurts. Sounds, so I don't know if you've noticed, but there are some sort of white noise sounds coming from some of like the projector equipment and things like that. And you're welcome. I'm sure if you didn't notice them, now you will. They may not filter those out. So if you're sitting in a work environment where all of that's going on, can you imagine how stressful that would be? So I had an adult, she wasn't a student, that I tested. I actually tested her and her sister and diagnosed both of them. So she worked at a retail chain, and she had worked at several different locations. And she came in and she told me that she preferred to work in one department in this location, but another in the other, because the sensory and the acoustics in the building were different, and the acoustics in certain departments at one location bothered her, but not at another. And if they can't verbalize that, so she was pretty insightful to be able to tell me that. If you can't verbalize that and you're just stressed, that's a big deal. That's going to affect you at work. The other thing over here is sensory interests. So this is less common, but not absent. So the girl's sister, the woman's sister, told me that, we have these laminated things that we use as part of the testing, and she's like, I could just sit here for hours and watch the light reflect off of this and kind of on the table. And as a kid, she got diagnosed with schizophrenia. She doesn't have schizophrenia. What's happening is she would sit with her hands, and she said, I'm playing with the shadows. She's not hallucinating. She's actually playing with shadows through her fingers. But nobody understood that. It was a sensory interest, and it resulted in some pretty significant misdiagnoses. So, sensory interests, but they can also be a motivator, and they can be a calming technique as well. So, trying to keep track of time here.
Sometimes sensory interest with food in older adolescents.
You can, yeah. You can find sensory interest and aversions. Well, and so if you think about the most sensitive parts of your body, your hands, the inside of your mouth, and the bottom of your feet. So one of our college students told me that different textures of flooring at home, she would get up on her toes and walk because it hurt the bottom of her feet. But her family didn't understand that's what she was doing, and so they would ridicule her or punish her for it. There are kids who will pack their mouths because of the sensory component. There are kids who are really late to start solid foods because I've had 3-year-olds who couldn't get beyond stage 1 baby food because their oral motor was just so sensitive. So yeah, those kinds of sensory, both interests and aversions, are very common. Yes?
For adults who may have less insight or spontaneously provide information, what questions are you asking in the diagnostic process?
So in the diagnostic process? Mm-hmm. So some of it is I'm setting up scenarios to have them have a conversation with me. I'm also asking them, so we have the ADOS, which is the measure that I use in this group for diagnostic purposes, does a nice job of setting up questions like, tell me about your friends. And so then I'm sort of following that to see, like, are these reciprocal? I'm getting a play-by-play of social interactions because sometimes they'll come in, even in like a therapy setting, and they'll say, this person was mean to me because of this. I'm like, well, okay, so how did it start? Okay, well, what did you say? Well, what did they say? What did you say? And then I'm like, oh, okay, so here's where we went wrong. Or here's where there was a misunderstanding. So I'm concrete, and I'm trying to gauge not what their perception is, but what others' perception likely is, especially if I don't have access to sort of a corroborating caregiver, spouse. I've had people come in with friends for diagnosis. The siblings, the sisters came in together. And so I'm pretty specific in what I'm looking for. And the ADOS questions do a nice job of that. Not that you have to give an ADOS to make the diagnosis, but I find it helpful. Other questions before we take a break? All right, well, it's 9:30. So we'll take a break until about 9:45, and then we'll come back and talk about things that go along with autism that may not be part of the diagnostic criteria.
What's the test you referred to?
ADOS, ADOS, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. We're on the second edition now.
I was gonna say, so when you start taking Q&A, I have a microphone back there. I didn't make it up in time. But if you wanna just repeat the question too.
I keep forgetting that.
For the
Thank you.
recording, I know, it's hard, it's so hard to remember. Because in the recording,
It
they
won't
won't be
pick
able
up,
to hear, and they'll just hear your answers to it. But you did repeat the first few. Just
And
the
then I
last
forgot.
one.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know, though, very interesting.
Most people are making their way back. So we'll get started again. All right. So just a few notes on the diagnostic process. You will see now levels 1, 2, and 3. So level 1 being so requiring less support, level 3 requiring very substantial support. And then you'll see in diagnostic criteria, you'll also see whether or not they have a language impairment and an intellectual impairment going with it. So that's just things you might see in patients that you're working with that have been diagnosed. So this is probably one of the most interesting aspects of working with autistic adults, or just autistic individuals in general, because, so if you think about us, we have reasonably average IQ, we have pretty consistently developed skills, so we may have some strengths and weaknesses, but in general, you know, we have pretty consistently developed skill sets. For people with an intellectual disability or a global delay, it's similar, just not quite where you would expect it to be compared to their peers. So they may have some strengths and weaknesses, but generally fairly evenly developed in terms of like their adaptive skills and their academic skills and their, you know, problem-solving skills, their language, those kinds of things. People with autism don't fit that. They may have, so I've had families come in and say, I'm glad he can do college-level calculus as a sophomore in high school, but when is he going to be able to shower without me standing outside the door telling him every single step? And so you may see one area of the development and assume, because in most cases, other areas are going to be similarly developed. But for autistic individuals, that's not necessarily the case. So just because one skill area seems advanced, or conversely, one skill area seems really delayed, doesn't mean everything else is going to be similarly developed. And this gets very confusing for people. I'll have teachers who are like, well, he's just being oppositional. He could do that if he wanted to because he can do X, Y, and Z. Like, not really. So, you know, he should understand that that's inappropriate to say because he's an intelligent boy. Well, he's intelligent, but that's not the same thing. And so this is something to keep in mind with this population, is the things that you think they should be able to do, you may be wrong. They need to teach that. So I want to take about 5 minutes and I want you to talk with your neighbors. So given what we've talked about, or your experiences personally with patients you've worked with, what are some strengths in this group? So take about 5 minutes, talk amongst yourselves. Let us know what strengths you see in your this population. Wrapping up. Just another minute or so. All right. So it looks like most people have sort of finished conversing. So tell me a little bit about what you guys came up with. Yes.
We sort of talked about the fact that once an individual with autism decides they're going to do something, they stick to it. It's like they've got that end goal in sight.
So they persevere.
Yes. And for me, the experience I've had with some of the individuals, there's no gray area. Everything is black or white, so you can't speak in abstract, but that can be a positive thing. So you tell them what you mean, and then they follow it.
Very direct, yeah.
And then there's the blunt honesty.
Which is in line with the blunt honesty, yeah. That is actually one of my favorite things about working with this group is the blunt honesty. So we all imply things in what we say. They may not. And so I had a student come in one day and she said, "You wear the same clothes every day." I was like, "Yep, I don't like shopping."
But we have one more on our list, and that is that the people that we work with, we feel like that they don't have an ulterior motive. They're not
Right.
trying to manipulate you. They're going to tell you what they want or tell you what they mean, and if they're spending time with you, it's because they like you. It's not to get to something else.
Yeah. That's not to say that they can't manipulate,
Right,
but in general, yeah. What you see is what you get. Yeah. Others?
I just think I work with schools, so I think what we see, especially in our younger kids, is that they think so differently. And so a lot of times when I would teach, I would be like, "Oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way," or "I didn't see it in that aspect." And then immediately you've got 2 or 3 other kids going, "Oh, I get it." So I just appreciate that about them, is that they don't look at the world the way the rest of us do.
Yeah.
A lot of problem solving from that.
I had, in the college program, we would go to meetings with professors, and it was a lot of fun, sometimes just to be a fly on the wall in some of those meetings, because you get a professor with their restricted interest that matches with a student with their restricted interest, and they're having conversations, and the professor's like, "I never thought about it that way," and they like love the conversations that they're having, and I'm over here like, "I'm going to take your word for it."
Not what you're talking about.
I don't know. So, very much so, yeah.
And they're not easily swayed, right? So kind of what they were saying, I always find that somebody can tell them they're wrong, and they're going to keep at it because they're not swayed by peer pressure or that peer influence.
Yeah. Others?
Maybe a hidden benefit of restricted interest, which is kind of problematic, is development of certain expertise,
Absolutely.
knowledge, albeit restricted, and recognition for that expertise.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of theories that some of the most innovative people out there probably are on the spectrum. People like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and, academia, for example. You've worked in academia, is kind of a sheltered workshop in many ways for this group because in academia, professors get to go in and have that interest. They get to talk at people about that interest, like I'm doing now, for hours. They get to research that interest, and then they get to hang out with people who also have that interest. But if you find that area where they are really good, what they accomplish is incredible. I had a student who was double majoring in electrical computer engineering and physics, and he wanted to take organic chem for fun. I'm glad there's people out there like that. And, you would have conversations with him about his physics knowledge and about, colonizing planets or things like that. And some people, you hear them talk about it and you're like, oh, okay. He might do it. He might actually do it because everything is so based in logic for him and science and fact, and he's got the expertise. And that's what Temple Grandin, so Temple Grandin, who is, if you're not familiar with her, she was in the slide where we were talking about causal relation, or sort of the relationship and the causes of autism, or potential, our current understanding of the causes. And she talks about, she's very well known in the autistic community. She's even better known in the agriculture community because her expertise gave her a different perspective for cattle. And she was able to figure out what was sort of impeding the success of some of the cattle yards. And so there's estimates that at least, maybe potentially half of the humane cattle yards in the country are based on her design. And her mom was told when she was 3 to put her in an institution because she'd never do anything. So you find that area of expertise. I have learned so much in this group, and it's so much fun. Others? Yes.
I'm a tutor,
Mm-hmm.
and I find that when I'm trying to teach some of my children that either are diagnosed or we just are guessing
Mm-hmm.
that we're like, yeah, probably. If you can leverage their special interest into another location, they suddenly understand in a way that overcomes whatever deficiency they may have had. I had one student who hated to write. I couldn't get him to write anything. And then he started talking about birds. And I was like, we are only writing about birds from now on. And suddenly he got it. So it's like there's almost like a little magic key that you can
Yep.
fit in sometimes.
So if you can leverage their special interest, then you can get motivation, and you can open potential sort of learning opportunities that may not have been available otherwise. Other strengths? Yes.
Great attention to detail.
Yes. Great attention to detail. Did you have one?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm Andrew McCoy. I'm the regional coordinator here for autism.
Oh, nice.
And so we talked about, like, the strength would be because they are so different. For instance, like we said, the twins. So they're so unique. Even though they're twins, they're different when it comes to, as far as their different symptoms, their different behaviors, things like that. So I feel like that's a strength because they are so different and so unique.
And that's going to lead.
One person with autism is
One person with autism.
because all of the children that we serve are completely different.
Which means that not only do you have this perspective that is probably unique compared to neurotypical people, but then you have 1 in 36 of those unique perspectives. And so it's a very fun group, I think, to work with. Not that it doesn't have its challenges, but it's a great, I think, group to work with. Other strengths?
Well, Melissa brought this up, but to me, but she said that generally that people with autism aren't gonna follow the crowd. They're not gonna just, go along with whatever other people are doing. So in a way, that's a real strength.
Yeah, and so they may not follow the crowd, they may not bend to peer pressure, and that's, I think, a very interesting point. If you think about a lot of stereotypes that we have adopted in society, a lot of them are not good and not accurate. A lot of the time we have to have conversations, it goes one of two ways. So we have to have conversations about why stereotypes exist. Those are things that we are taught without being aware that we're being taught them, and it's like kind of foreign to some of the adults that I've worked with. The other thing is that where they get their stereotypes may not be accurate. So one of the students came to me and said that it's really easy to spot a gay man because he's always carrying a chihuahua in a purse. Well, so I don't know where that stereotype came from for her, but it was fairly easy to have a conversation about like why that doesn't necessarily ring true. Yes, the idea of stereotypes and peer pressure. And this is an area where I struggle a little bit with other experts in the field. You know, some people will be like, oh, we need to make them fit in with the stereotypes. You know, we need to teach girls how to dress in a way that's going to be accepted. Or we need to teach guys how to behave in a way that's going to be accepted as traditional. I disagree with that. Now, I want them to understand how others are going to perceive that so that that decision is based on all the information they need. But we had a student who wanted to wear a one-piece leotard. Like, okay. Other people are not going to understand that. People might stare. He's like, but it's comfortable for me. I'm like, then you do you. Now, when you start an internship, here's the expectation in a job setting. And so he wore it underneath his khakis. All right, you do you. Students who don't want to wear makeup, who don't want to, you know, wear skirts. I'm like, all right, you do you. And finding the group where that's acceptable. So I think those are actually definitely, in my opinion, strengths. Yes?
This might be a little too broad, but I almost wonder why we call it a disorder and why we call them symptoms instead of just characteristics, because it's pathologizing something that is really, in many cases, quite beautiful, you know, special.
And so her statement was, sometimes we seem to be pathologizing things and in terming it a disorder that may not need to be pathologized. And that is, a lot of the self-advocates I've worked with agree. So one of them actually considers Autism Speaks a hate group because they talk about curing autism. And he doesn't feel that it needs a cure. Now, this group is a subset. I'm sure that there are others out there who, if given the option, you know, might prefer to have some of their symptoms taken away. And so I think it really depends on the self-advocate. But I definitely think that there are strengths. One of the students told me that he wished the rest of the world had Asperger's because those of us without it think too much with our emotions. Okay. I can see that. The reason that I talk about strengths and that we've spent so much time talking about it is because it is classified as a disorder. But it doesn't, and it will, because the rest of the world doesn't think the way that they do, it can get in the way of them being able to integrate into the rest of the world. And there's a lot of, in the neurodiversity movement, there's a lot of push for the rest of the world to shift a little bit too. So not just them having to shift to fit into our way of doing things and our way of saying things, but us shifting a little bit. And it is interesting, I think, so if you look at the college support programs that have popped up, a lot of them are on the East Coast. And I was talking with Alex Plank, who he consults with various individuals, like TV shows, so he consults with The Good Doctor. He was on an episode of The Good Doctor. He came here for the autism conference one year, and he was talking about the different reactions that he gets when he tells people he's on the spectrum. He says, in the South, or on the East Coast, I tell them, and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry. On the West Coast, he tells them, and they're like, oh, that's so cool. And so that kind of difference in perspective and how we view things, even across the U.S. and U.S. culture and different cultures around the country are it can be very different how we interpret that. And so I think it's very important to remember that, yes, it can create challenges, and the degree of those challenges is going to be different from across the spectrum. But there are definitely strengths that can be associated with it. So another one that was sort of hinted at is that when they get into a routine, often they stay in that routine. So I had a student that if group meetings started at 5:30 and ended at 7, he was going to be there at 5 minutes till 5:30, and he was going to leave at 7. And as an employee, he would be fantastic because he's going to be there. He is not going to break the rules and call out sick, because that's, unless he's actually sick, you know, if you give him this set of rules. Now, not all individuals are as rule following, and sometimes the routine they get into isn't as productive, or the rules that they follow aren't necessarily as productive. But definitely there is a tendency for preference for routine, and if you can get them into a routine that's productive, they will often maintain it. So I think we've touched on a lot of these. So the interests may lead to productivity, preference for predictability, not as preoccupied with social norms, unique perspectives. So in our sort of initial diagram, we talked about the differences in how they process what's going on around them. And so these are not part of the diagnostic criteria, but are some ideas about what might sort of drive some of the symptoms that we see, but these also might affect treatment and how you approach treatment. So we're going to talk through some of these in this section. So the first big sort of cognitive difference. How many of you are familiar with executive function? Okay. So not everybody is. Usually when I do this talk, not everybody is. So executive function is your ability to organize the world around you. It's not your intelligence necessarily. It's how well you can take, say, you know, this is my long-term goal. So I've got to do this, 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 and this to get there. And it's going to take me this long to do this long to do this long to do this. It's the connection of, if I do this, this is going to happen. So connecting actions and consequences. It's working memory. So being able to hold things in memory, process it, and spit it back out. It's the ability to flexibly think. So when plan A doesn't work, what is plan B? And it's the ability to shift attention. So if you think about these things, what are some areas in life where if you have difficulty with these things, that you're going to struggle? All of them, yes, all of them. And so the planning and prioritizing. So a lot of parents come in and say, I tell him to clean his room and he doesn't do it. Okay, well, what is he supposed to do to clean his room? Well, he's supposed to clean his room. Like, yeah, but he doesn't know what that means. So we talk about he can't take this big task of clean your room and break it down. College was a struggle for a lot of students because in high school, your teacher says, all right, you need to be doing this part of your paper this date. This is due by this date. This is due by this date. You may get to college and they say, this paper is due in a month. Go. And then you're like, well, I don't know where to get started. So some of the students just wouldn't start. Some of them would get started and then get stuck and perseverate on the research part. So they would have researched and researched and researched, but then you have to take all of those pieces, fit them together into categories, which is an executive function, and then explain those to other people. So all of that is executive function. When plan A doesn't work, there may not be a plan B. So when your route from your apartment to the grocery store doesn't work, all bets are off. And so we had a student who always bought socks at Walmart. He ran out of socks. So he decided he was going to walk to Walmart. It's like, you don't do that in Tuscaloosa. You do not walk from campus to Walmart. Either Walmart. And so we had a discussion about, okay, well, where else could you get socks? Your parents could mail them to you. You could order them online. Now you can have it shipped, deliver anything you want it to. You could go to the university supply store and buy socks. Now they're going to be covered in Alabama A's, but they will work. So there's a lot of different potential plans that you could use to problem solve it. All of those were mind-blowing to him because plan A didn't work. And this can be a source of anxiety. This is probably, in many cases, why there's so much rigidity around routines, because that is plan A. And when that's not what happens, then we don't know what's happening now. Flexible thinking, shifting attention. So one of the students told me that it takes him about 45 minutes to shift from one subject, studying one subject, to another. His brain just gets so stuck in one area that he can't shift it to that other area, which in college is a problem because you have a lot of different things that you're trying to balance. You're not usually taking just one class. Theory of mind. So you've probably heard this in connection with autism. So this is a task that you probably can't see this very easily, but it's a task, we call it the Sally Ann task. So you have two girls, Sally and Ann. Sally puts her ball in the red cupboard and then leaves. Ann takes the ball and moves it to the blue cupboard. When Sally comes back, where is she going to look for the ball? In the red cupboard. But you have to be able to put yourself in her shoes to know what information she's missing and that she didn't see that move. So a lot of really young people with autism might say she'll look in the blue cupboard because they know it's in the blue cupboard. So she knows it's in the blue cupboard. If you've ever had a conversation on the phone with a 3-year-old who's neurotypical and they just got a new toy, they're talking about it like you can see it, but obviously you can't, and they don't know that. That's theory of mind. They can't put themselves in your shoes to realize what you know and what you don't know, what you can see and what you can't see. So some of these adults, adolescents and adults, may leave out information, not because they're lying, because they didn't know you needed it. So there was one day, I had been hearing some scratching noises. I didn't know where it was coming from. I've been hearing it for a couple hours, though. So finally, one of the students comes out of the study hall room and tells me, there's a squirrel in the study hall room. I'm pretty sure the squirrel had been in there for 2 hours. Nobody thought I might need to know that. It then ran out of the study hall room and into my office, where it lived for the next day. So I had a pet squirrel until the campus wildlife person came and found it. So the conversations you have, they may seem disjointed, but mostly because in their mind they know what they're communicating. They don't know how you're going to interpret it. So we had somebody I've worked with who talked about hearing voices. And so I'm like, okay, well, and in sort of talking through what those voices were, I actually think it was this internal monologue. I don't think he was hearing voices. But he didn't know how to communicate that or understand that a lot of people do have an internal monologue. And so to him, he was hearing voices. And so obviously that gets confusing from the standpoint of treatment, because what you do for someone who's hearing voices versus what you do for someone whose internal monologue is indicating depression are very different. But he didn't know how other people interpreted that, or that other people may have similar experiences. So something else we talk about is one of the things we mentioned in the strengths. So it's called weak central coherence, meaning taking all of these details and putting them together in a whole. So they may get so focused on a detail that they may not see the bigger picture. And in a related sort of developing what we call schemas. So Temple Grandin, if you read her book, Thinking in Pictures, she talks about how she couldn't figure out what people were talking about when they had this general reference to a cat. So the two images in mind that she had of a cat were so different, or a dog. Like, so somebody says cat, and it's this specific detailed image. She didn't then create a sort of general prototype in her mind about what a cat is. So every time she saw a different looking cat, she had to file it away. This is a cat, or this is a dog, until she had enough to detect a pattern. And then she talks about how she detected the pattern in that. So the way that she processed that was very different. You and I would see a few cats and be like, oh, cat. You know, and this takes some time to develop. So my 3-year-old niece went to the zoo once and everything was a dog. But at some point, she learned to differentiate. So that can be tricky. Yes?
In very young children, is that what kind of makes them have delayed ability to recognize similar and different items?
Potentially. So the question is that what can delay their ability to recognize similar and different items? Potentially. Some of them actually get really good at matching because they are so focused on details that they can match identically. But then if it's not identical, it's like, okay, now what is this?
Like letters as well?
Yes. So I've actually had conversations with parents because when they change the font, it's not the same letter. And that was kind of mind-blowing. They're like, but he knows the letter. I'm like, yeah, but is it in the same font? Nope. Okay, well, he is so focused on detailed aspects of that font that he may not actually recognize that it is the same letter. And so then this is another one. This is a very interesting area. So implicit learning is anything you learned without knowing you were learning it. So take, for example, language. We were putting pronouns, adverbs, and adjectives together in the right order long before anyone sat us down and told us what a pronoun, adverb, and adjective were. So we eventually explicitly learned language when they sat us down and told us all those rules, but we were already doing it, for the most part. Some people might argue in the South that we don't. But for the most part, we were putting them together in the right order. Behavior in an elevator. When you get on an elevator with one other person, what do you do? Yep. So you stand with your back facing the back. You stand at the other side. You stare straight forward. Although I'm told we talk a lot in the elevators in the South. Peter Gerhardt, and if you ever get a chance to see him, he's fantastic. But he came from New York to an autism conference and said that we're very social in elevators here. Who told you that that's what you do in an elevator? Nobody. So if you ask somebody out and they say, I'm busy, What does that mean? Probably not interested. Who told you that? Because the response I get is they would just tell me if they're not interested. Like, no, they won't. Because I think that it's going to hurt your feelings. But it's not going to hurt my feelings. But they don't know that. So there you've got the theory of mind and a little bit of implicit learning in terms of how you learned anything in the dating world. It's all implicit. When you make a friend in elementary school, how do you do that? What do you do to make a friend in elementary school? I know, we're all thinking about it because we just did it. You know, you found a group to play with, you talked to them about things that they liked, they talked to you about things that you liked, you played with similar toys, you decided you wanted to hang out at each other's houses, you know, those kinds of things. But nobody tells you that. You just do it. Nobody sits you down and defines what an acquaintance is versus a friend, versus a best friend, versus a romantic relationship. You just kind of navigate that. That's tricky because anything you learned without knowing you were learning it may be difficult for them to learn. Now, that doesn't mean they can't. So they may just learn it the same way that we learn things like math. So they may need specific guidance. So one of the questions I get all the time is, small talk is ridiculous, why do we do it? And there's some truth to that. So, but it makes you think, why do we do that? Why do we make small talk? Has anyone ever thought about that? And so, largely, there's a couple of functions. One is because neurotypical people don't like silence. And so we feel like, oh, what are they saying? What are they thinking about me if I'm not talking? I need to talk about something. We also do it to kind of gauge their sort of interests and whether or not they're somebody we want to continue to talk with. So it's very surface level. It's very safe to talk about. But it can lead to deeper conversations. Sometimes it's just a time filler because it's interesting. Sometimes it's not interesting. So, but all of those things, like making small talk, are things that we learn without anybody telling us. So some of the other things that can go along medically, sleep. Sleep is a big problem for a lot of this group. Really starting from an early age, it can be a very big problem. Their sleep cycles may not be the same, so I talked about the serial napper. You know, there's some evidence that maybe their natural chemical production related to sleep cycles is different. Now, there's also sensory sensitivities. So I've had parents come in and we ended up suggesting things like one of those tent beds to block out light, to block out sound, because the slightest change in their environment, and for all of us, when you wake up, we all go through sleep-wake cycles at night, and if you are in a waking cycle, if your environment is not what it was when you went to sleep, then your brain is a little bit alerted. For them, if you have sensory sensitivities, then they may wake up at the slightest sound, a truck driving by outside. So things like white noise machines, if they don't bother them, can block that out. Melatonin, other medical things, consulting with their primary care doctor can also help with this. Their restricted interest. So poor sleep hygiene. They're on their phones, which we all do it, I'm guilty. They're on their phones scrolling through fan fiction when they should be trying to fall asleep. And obviously the phones are alerting them. Anxiety, depression, epilepsy, so seizures can all affect sleep. So if you haven't slept, how does that affect you? Makes you grouchy. Things you might be able to cope with otherwise, you can't cope with. So what may be baseline level anxiety is now at a 10 because you haven't slept. You can't focus. So, I mean, we all do it. If I haven't slept, I'm not as productive at work. Seizures. So seizures are more common, not universal. So I don't want to freak families out with this. But it is more common for people with autism to experience seizures, especially beginning in either early childhood or in adolescence. And these seizures tend to be more difficult to treat. But seizures can also affect your mood, your sleep, your daily functioning. So this is something to keep in mind as well.
Have they figured out why?
I don't know. I haven't seen anything, but
Fascinating.
I mean, we know that there's differences in how the brain is structured and connectivity, so. All types, I believe, of seizures, so I didn't get into the specifics of the type of seizure, but things like absence seizures and grand mal seizures. And it doesn't seem necessarily connected to, so it is more likely if you have other like intellectual disability and things like that, but the prevalence or the chance is still elevated even if you don't have other neurological issues. Yeah.
I don't know if you get into this anymore, but any other medical issues like gastro
Oh, yeah.
problems?
Yeah, our developmental behavioral pediatricians specialize in constipation. Because, so if you think about it, if you have a very limited variety of foods you're willing to eat, then your GI system, so the kid that eats grilled cheese sandwiches for every meal, his GI system, probably not thrilled about that, yeah. And so GI issues are very common, especially constipation.
hard too, because my grandson is on the spectrum and we have to take him to a gastroenterologist, but they said that a lot of times they purposefully withhold too.
Because of the sensation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so that's his issue, and so,
So there are sensory aspects to going to the bathroom. So if it hurts once, you don't want to go again. And so, or you can have the opposite. So young kids who think it feels cool and play in it. Yeah. They don't realize that we all think that's gross. To them, it's Play-Doh. I know. Yeah. And so that GI issues. Motor issues, they may be less coordinated. There's a really significant percentage that have fine motor issues, and so this will affect things like buttoning buttons. I've had adults who never learned to tie their shoes, and since we all wear slip-ons, why fight that battle? But that can be a challenge. They may not be as coordinated in terms of like athletics, and so if you think about a lot in high school, a lot of social clubs and organizations involve some amount of athletics, especially for boys. So finding groups that they fit into. And parents often are like, I want them to do a sport. And I'm like, well, okay, cool, let's think about that. And so we'll talk about sports that are individual within a team. So track and field, swimming, tennis, martial arts. So they can help with motor function, but if the person doesn't get either the social demands of, say, baseball, or doesn't have the same level of motor coordination as their peers and starts to get sort of ostracized, then it doesn't have the same effect in some of these other types of sports. Yes?
Do you find that putting a child in a sport helps them overcome social difficulty, or do they simply kind of like learn the situational masking?
So does putting them in a sport help them with social difficulty? I would say it can, if they're motivated to be there. It's kind of the same thing that you mentioned earlier. If you find their restricted interest, then it can be an avenue for learning. And so if they're very interested in this sport, then they may be more motivated to go, they may be more motivated to interact. And anytime you're trying to work on social interaction, there has to be an opportunity for that. And so any common interest that they may share is an opportunity for that, whether it's a sport or gaming sessions at GameStop, or the club that dresses up and reenacts historical time periods. You know. As long as they're motivated, it can be very good. Genetics. So we talked a little bit about this, but there are also some genetic conditions within which autism is more common. So things like tuberous sclerosis, Fragile X, neurofibromatosis. So you may have autism symptoms, but there may be this other cluster of medical complications that you're dealing with that go along with, say, tubers or any of the complications that can go along with these. Mental health, which is why a lot of us are here. There's estimates that maybe half of this group has some kind of anxiety or depression. They often report wanting friends but not being able to make them. So I distinguish between not having friends but not wanting them and wanting friends but not knowing how to get them. Because to me that's two very different things. One contributes to depression. One, if you push friendships, increases anxiety and things like that. But I do try to be careful. Are they saying they don't want friends because the prospect is anxiety provoking? Or do they truly not really see the benefit in sort of non-structured interaction with other people? So yeah, well, so some of them can form them, they just can't keep it going. So you meet people, but then you have to build it. And that's really one of the key areas where they have trouble is.
Keeps anxiety up.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know.
Right. And it's kind of like the example I gave earlier of the person who, there's these online interactions and conversations, but you got to keep them going. And how do you do that? Okay, so the people on the bus, for example, that I mentioned earlier. So you say hi to them, but how do you sort of take it to the next level? There are people that you're talking to in class, but how do you maintain that after the semester ends? There may be people, so some of the people I've worked with, as long as they have somewhere to go every 2 weeks to play board games or video games, whatever their interest is, they're fine. They don't really feel the need to hang out with them outside of that, and that's fine. But then there becomes the question of if they do, how do you do that? Because most relationships develop initially in a structured setting. School, online forum, work, church, but then to be a friendship, it has to venture outside of that. For most people, to consider it a close friendship, it would have to venture outside of that structured setting. And for some of the people that we work with, they may not care if it does. But some may want it to and not know how. So, we're going to pause, we're going to do this question. So, what are some of the targets of treatments or targets for treatment that you guys have come across or that you anticipate if you haven't worked with individuals with autism? Take some time, about 5 minutes, talk with those near you and kind of talk about what are some of the goals for treatment that you guys have encountered. So you guys can wrap up your conversations. We're going to take a break until about 11, so we'll take about 15 minutes, and then come back together and talk about adapting those treatments and addressing treatment goals.
Ryan's presentation, and that's going to bring up on your phone the options of what CEUs you want to receive for today. You can click into multiple ones of them, and you're going to answer some questions to fill out the forms with that. The QR code is also going to be sent out through email post-workshop, so if you don't get it at the end of today, or clear that part out on your phone, it will come to you. And there was an additional reading that is suggested by Dr. Ryan. It's a book by Valerie Goss called Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Adults with Autism Spectrum Disorder. And so with your information that you got for today, the email from Continuing Studies, there is a link in there to a box folder that has resources. in there's a document that has the name of this book and the authors so that you can find that if you wish to purchase that independently after today.
And the slides also have a lot of other resources in them that will be helpful. And I'm going to try and give some examples like of some of the visuals and things like that that we've just developed over time so that you guys don't have to reinvent the wheel. And a lot of those will go into the box as well. So, based on your conversations before the break, what are some of the treatment goals that are presented to you in your practice? What are some of the things that you are approached to help address? Emotion regulation, yeah. Anger management, outbursts, social skills, anxiety, toilet training, yeah.
Any kind of transitional, so.
Transitions. Not just like within the day, but also sort of big life transitions. Leaving high school and the service cliff that happens. You just kind of fall off the edge after you leave high school. Behavior management in the classroom. Others? Yes.
Is there any observational or anecdotal information about when families have to move, like the military or whatever, and here's a kid who's 14, and of course they're going to have problems anyway.
Right. And so a lot of that probably depends on where they're moving from and to. So any kind of transitions, we'll talk some about social stories, but preparing them in advance, so as much as you can, let them experience it. Same thing from moving from like middle school to high school. Let them go and let them go visit. Make it a gradual transition. Identifying services, it depends on where you're leaving and where you're going. So I've had families call me and be like, I'm moving from such and such state where we get 25 hours a week of ABA therapy, and they come into the church and to the grocery store with us. And I'm wondering how I can get that set up there. I'm like, yeah. So, there are some states that have a lot of resources and some states that don't. And so kind of piecing together resources in the area can be tricky. Alabama actually has an advantage because we have the regional autism networks. So we may not have as many resources as a state like North Carolina or Pennsylvania or New Jersey. But we do have a group that's trying to centrally locate information about the resources that we do have. Florida has a similar program with CARD. North Carolina has a similar program with TEACH. And so getting connected to those programs can also be very helpful. Other treatment goals?
Adaptive skills, I think that goes back to the toileting, but all the way up through.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I talked about students have graduated high school and still can't shower independently. We've had students that we were trying to work on getting them to shower at least weekly. And not even like an I don't want to, like a, conversations about, one, it doesn't feel good. Or two, like, how often should you put on deodorant? Well, once a week. Well, if you're showering daily, which you just told me you did, then you probably should put on deodorant more than that. So like organizing that is an executive function. So adaptive skills.
Like using a brush, toothbrush, or
Yeah, so it's both an adaptive skill because you've got to put it in your routine somewhere. And so you've got to know where it should fit in your routine, kind of like you're not going to put your sock or your shoes on before you put your socks on. So where does it make sense in your routine with the combing and brushing your teeth? You probably should do the toothbrushing before breakfast or after breakfast, those kinds of things. But then you also have the fine motor component to that too. So gripping the toothbrush and being coordinated enough with the toothbrush. Then you have a sensory component to that too. I've had students tell me they didn't like the taste of toothpaste. They don't like the way it feels. They'd rather brush with baking soda, which to me would seem worse. But they would rather. Yes?
I have a client that parents report that he does case of toothpaste, but he only likes one specific flavor. And if he doesn't get that flavor, he's not gonna put the flavor.
Oh, yeah.
And then I have another one that does not like, just the brush touching his teeth at all.
Yes.
So they have, to figure out how exactly they want to manage.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get creative. So if they don't like the sensation of the brush, a lot of, this group can be very brand specific about, as you mentioned, toothpaste, but other things as well. And so once you find something that works, you better buy as many as you can find. Because if they discontinue that, then now you've got a problem. Other treatment goals that you guys are presented with? Communication. So not just like language, but social use of language. And this is where a lot of people get confused because their language, so like if you look at their language testing, they may have high, average, or better language. We joke that they sound like little professors sometimes as kids because the words that they use are so far beyond what another kid, I'll have a 3-year-old come in, minimally verbal, can't ask for juice, but I bring out a picture book and they're labeling hexagons and octagons, and you're just like, wow. Now, they can't use those words to ask for things socially. They can't have those conversations, and so that communication, being able to communicate what's in their mind, but also teaching those around them not to make assumptions about what they're trying to communicate, but to truly think about the words that both they're using and the words that the person that's working with them. So in my role here, when I was here, it pushed me to think probably more than anything else about the words that I choose and how I'm using them and how I intend them. Because some of them, will come back to me and say, now you said this, is this what you meant? I'm like, no, actually, that's not what I meant. Thank you for asking. So yes. Yes.
It's not necessarily coming from a school environment. If you have high blood pressure, you're going to take medicine. So often we have students that are diagnosed with autism that are on so much medication that you're not sure what they're really capable of doing.
Absolutely.
And that's a big challenge.
Yeah, that's one of our a lot of our developmental behavioral pediatricians at Sparks, that's a big sort of push for them, is to make sure that the medications are intentional in terms of what they're treating. And we'll get into this a little bit, but my biggest thing, so when I'm doing this talk for medical residents or medical students or psychiatrists, primary care physicians, is what is driving the behavior. So, okay, it's aggression, but why? Because if you're going to medicate the aggressive behavior with antipsychotics, you're toning it down, but you're not really looking at why it's happening. And so kind of my personal soapbox, aggression is communicative. And if you can't find another way to communicate and you don't have other strategies to get what you need, then you're going to, you can't just not communicate. You're going to have some experience, some outburst, if you don't have those coping strategies. And so a lot of times at the root of aggression is something like anxiety. So I don't know how to deal with this, or a lack of sleep, or sensory overload, or, a lack of social, sort of other social options. So like I give the example when I'm doing this for younger children, and there's a slide in here that we'll get to, I hope. You may have two kids sitting next to each other, and the kid with autism keeps hitting the kid that they're trying to play with. Now, a lot of us would assume if it's a neurotypical kid, oh, they're being mean. They don't want to play with them. They're trying to get a toy. And they may be trying some of that. But it may be that when the kid with autism hits the other kid, there's a sound that they make that is fun. It may be when they hit the other kid, the kid then turns around and responds and gives them a toy. And so now they've initiated a social interaction and they got what they wanted out of it. It may be that the other kid is making noises that are too loud. And when they hit that kid, the kid leaves, and now what was annoying us is no longer annoying us. And the same thing applies, and we'll talk about this a little bit too, at an adult level. What is driving it? We have to change our assumptions about what might be driving what we're seeing if we're going to adequately address it. So yeah, that's just my personal soapbox. So I've seen people who had significant anxiety which resulted in aggression. Nobody had ever thought to medicate the anxiety. They'd been medicated for aggression. And when I made the suggestion, why don't you talk to his prescribing physician about anxiety medication? Because I think that this is, I don't prescribe. This is not my area of expertise. But it seems like a lot of this is driven by aggression. And the kid, about 4 to 6 weeks after starting anxiety meds, came back to the parent and said, I still get nervous, but I don't feel like hitting people anymore. And the things that could have been prevented, had that been the initial approach, where that kid would be right now, I don't know. So I think a lot of these we've talked about, so language, social skills, repetitive behaviors, transitions, rigidity, daily hassles, so adaptive skills, when things are slightly different than we were expecting, how do we cope with that? Underemployment, so this is a really big issue in this group. One of the things that, had I been here longer with our college program, I wanted to do was make sure that once they leave, they get a degree, but what do they do with that? And so a lot of the supports in the state are very focused on getting you a job. We need to focus on career building. So, students with incredible computer skills and great visual design skills, let's get them into an AutoCAD certification. Let's think outside the box, get them into web design, get them into, something that is related but taps into those expertise. And that is a big challenge because then you can find them this area, but then you have to teach them the interview skills to present themselves for the job. And then you have to navigate all of the implicit social rules of a workplace. And every workplace looks different. Improving executive function, coping with anxiety and depression, addressing challenging behaviors. And then the bottom one, so this group can be, not always, but can be very trusting. Because for them, what you see is what you get. What they say is what they mean. So they may be at risk for being taken advantage of, especially girls in this group. Tony Atwood has written a book on girls with autism. And so not unusual for a lot of the female adult clients that I work with to also have PTSD. Students girls whose parents didn't see it, didn't totally understand, thought it was manipulative, or people who were abused sexually, physically, getting into situations. So had students who were approached on campus. This was shortly after the tornadoes here. Somebody was like, yeah, my house was destroyed in the tornadoes. They made sure to point out they were a good Christian, that they just needed some help. And so the student put them in the car, took them to Walmart, took them to the ATM. And then they were like, oh, you can drop me off here, because the student was going to take them somewhere else. And we had to have a discussion about how people will present themselves in a way that they think you're going to think is a positive light that elicits sympathy in order to get things from you that they need. And then how to respond to that. So they've been told not to lie. But when we're approached by somebody who's panhandling, how many of us say, oh, I don't have cash on me? Or I can't right now. And is that an okay lie? And how do you distinguish that? And how do you teach that nuance? So those are all definitely some treatment goals. So this was the image I was talking about earlier. So what you may see is aggression or avoidant behavior or not following through on plans that you guys made in a session, homework or activities you want them to engage in. What might actually be happening, though, is they don't have the executive function to plan that activity, and you didn't go into enough detail to help them actually enact it. Or there may be some sensory sensitivities that are resulting in the avoidant behavior. That's why they're not going to the grocery store for themselves. Or they may have no idea what to say when they get Verizon on the phone to fix their phone issue. So they just don't call. It doesn't mean that they're being lazy. It doesn't mean that they're being oppositional. It means that they don't know where to start. And so what's driving that? And so we need to really look at what we see. So, okay, you haven't showered in 2 weeks. And just telling them you need to shower at least 4 times a week, will, shoot for 4 times a week, then that's not going to fix it because it doesn't tell us why. Is it a sensory thing? Do they not like the bathroom? Do they not know how the shower in their apartment works because it's different than the one at home? So the laundry machine in a laundromat is going to be different from the one they probably learned on in high school with their parents. And so those kinds of things can get in the way of actually both following through with treatments, but also can cause some of the symptoms that we are attempting to treat. One example of this, I had a student who was calling people benches, B-E-N-C-H-E-S, especially girls. It got a reaction. You can imagine why. Benches was not what they heard. And they told him to stop. Well, he didn't stop. Turns out he had no idea why he was getting the reaction. He had no idea what they heard and why it was, he just knew he was getting a reaction. So what we did was we gave him another way to initiate those interactions, and it stopped. Just telling him stop didn't fix it because it didn't give him something to do that served the same purpose. So we didn't really address why it was happening if we just say stop. So, we've talked today about the core sort of social, sort of diagnostic symptoms. We've talked about some of the differences in processing. There's also some differences in emotion regulation. So I was talking earlier in a conversation, they may not actually recognize different types of emotions. So not just in other people, but in themselves. So they may know, I'm good, I'm not good. But what not good means may be very difficult. They may also recognize, I'm not good, but by the time they recognize that, they are at 60. And it went from 0 to 60 without any recognition that there was a gray area in there where we might have been able to turn this in a different direction. And so these differences in emotion regulation can all create the challenges that you guys discussed in terms of the treatment goals. So all of those things that we talked about that you're seeing patients for, whether it be in a school setting or in a community setting, these things can contribute. But then they get into treatment. And those things can also impact their response to treatment. So, as I mentioned, maybe they don't have the executive function to follow through on some of the career building stuff you guys are working on. Maybe they don't have the fine motor skills to learn to tie their shoes. Maybe they don't have the fine motor skills to brush their teeth. Maybe they don't have, maybe they don't have the motivation. They're not interested in some of the goals that whoever is recommending therapy, if it's not them, has kind of brought them in. So I would have parents come in and say, I think they need to live in a dorm room with another kid. I'd be like, why? So that they learn how to live with someone else. Right? They're not going to be sharing a 9x9 box with somebody in the future. Why should they learn to do that now? They need time to just go have autism. Because everything else in their world is social from the second they step outside their dorm room. So maybe our goals were a neurotypical goal, and their goals don't match. So not only do the symptoms that we've spent the first part of today talking about affect their symptom presentation that may get them into therapy, but it also can affect how we go about implementing therapy and how we address barriers in interventions. So for example, some of the things that can build or drive the symptoms that get them into therapy, maybe they're misperceiving social norms. They think that they're supposed to have somebody to eat with all the time. They're having trouble forming and maintaining relationships, and they want them. They want to date, but don't know how. They want people to hang out with, but don't understand why it happens once or twice and then the other person ghosts them. They're not recognizing how they may have contributed in a social situation to whatever happened. So we had I was working with somebody who was convinced that people who told her not to spend money were evil. But her bank account was a couple $1,000s overdrawn. And so when I told her, I don't think you should buy that, she thought that I was trying to control her life. I'm like, I'm not making that decision for you. The bank has made that decision, but not recognizing her role in how that situation came to be. A lack of social support. So if they're interested in relationships, but don't have them, then we all go to, so, we'll talk about this in a minute, but one of my big sort of take-home points that I always really encourage for patients that I work with is being independent doesn't mean being independent. Being independent means knowing who has the ability to help you. None of us knows everything. And none of us can do everything by ourselves. That's where social support comes in. But we get so focused on teaching, oh, you got to be independent with this. You got to be independent with that. We create behavior plans and we send them to the grocery store, to borrow from one of Peter Gerhardt's example, and they forget the milk, and then we create a behavior plan so that they don't forget the milk next time. But how many of us forget the milk? I went to the grocery store the other day and forgot the loaf of bread. And so we set almost unrealistic expectations that they have to be completely independent. And some of them have internalized this. Like, if I'm going to be an adult, I have to be independent. That's not true. You have to know how to get help. I joke, unless you're Jesus, you don't know everything. And so you have to be able to find the help that you need. And seeking that help doesn't make you disabled. But if you don't have a social support network, then where do you go for that help? Pressure to conform to ill-fitting social norms. So, I gave the example of the guy who wanted to wear the one-piece leotard. There are probably places where he could do that and nobody would bat an eye. Here, they do. And so again, my approach to this is I want them to know what the norms are, how what they're doing might be perceived, so that they are making an informed decision. But it is not my job to tell them how to dress, to tell them, you know, what interests they should have, to tell them, you know, how to approach things. It is my job to make sure that they have the neurotypical perspective so that whatever decisions they make are informed. Rigidity around routines, sensory aversions, difficulty managing time due to restricted interests, difficulty with self-advocacy. So I hinted at this a minute ago, but self-advocacy requires, one, that you know what your strengths and weaknesses are. So we're already a little bit behind because that can be, not always, but can be a challenge for this group, knowing what their strengths and challenges are, because they don't recognize areas where they may have contributed to things, to interactions that went wrong or to situations that maybe didn't turn out the way they wanted to, which is how we figure out what our strengths and weaknesses are. So then you have to have the insight to know, okay, I need help with this. Who can help? So that's second. Then you have to have the social skills to be able to effectively get help. So I can't tell you how many times I had to talk students out of saying, in an email to a professor, you graded my test wrong. That's not going to get you help. And so working with how to effectively advocate for yourself. Now, maybe the professor did grade that test wrong. Maybe there's something that the student doesn't know that the professor does, and that they just need that explained. But if the student goes into it with that assumption, that's not going to get them help. Doesn't mean that they are judging the professor. It doesn't mean that they are trying to be hard-headed. It just means that this is my thought, and this is the only way I know to communicate that thought to you. Now, these difficulties can also affect how they respond to treatment, though. So you may say something. You may like to use metaphors. I am sarcastic, but I had to learn to watch it. Using metaphors. Professors who've used metaphors in class, and the student comes back to me, do they really mean that this is going to happen? I'm like, no, it's an example. Think of it as an example. You know, the way that we choose our language, I gave the example earlier that I've had patients come back to me and say, now, when you said this, did it mean this? And I love it when a patient will do that for me, because otherwise I don't know what they heard. So unless they tell me what they were thinking I said, and so I try to be as literal as I can, but sometimes it's not possible. Communication differences that impact. So the thing about, you know, telling me that they're hearing voices versus telling me that their internal monologue is negative. So those kinds of communication differences, I have to really get kind of detailed to figure that out. They may not know where a social situation went wrong because they have a perspective. But without, you know, there's two sides to every coin. Without the other perspective, you're left kind of guessing. So you may think, you know, we had a student come in and we thought that she was just being abused. Turns out that her parents were just trying to give her direction, and that was interpreted very negatively. So they may, if they need to do something in between sessions, like I said, if they need to call Verizon because their cell phone's not working anymore, they may not even know where to start. If you have to cancel, that may be a problem. Getting into the routine of coming to therapy may be challenging. If your office is overwhelming, I try to keep rooms as sparse as possible, with the exception maybe of like a fidget toy for those that need to do something with their hands. Because if there's, and even with the lighting, so one of the things we don't do at Sparks that I wish we did is have less reliance on these kinds of lights, because a lot of times I'll have people come in and want to turn the lights off. And here, when I was here in our building on campus, there was a room that was well lit with windows. And so I had an adult patient, first time diagnosis, come in. The first thing he did was ask, can I turn off the lights? And in that room I could say yes. In others I can't. Because the fluorescence bothered him. And so having that flexibility in office space, things you may not even consider. Reinforcers may look different. Their reinforcer at the end of a session for participating may mean staring at the clock for 5 minutes. It may mean, so I'm currently watching Hotel Transylvania every week, 1 episode a week, because that is reinforcing for a client. And she is more willing to participate in sessions if I have invested that time too. And so in order to be of value to her, I sort of work with that restricted interest. So I was in my office watching Hotel Transylvania. We may make assumptions about their goals that may not be accurate because we are coming at it largely, I would assume, from a neurotypical perspective. So we may think, oh, not having friends, that has to be very lonely. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I had a student, flip side to this, I had a student who didn't understand, he was talking about, he was very frustrated with one of his parents because they had not made any attempt in his mind to sort of grow their skills and expand beyond their work position. Like, well, maybe learning is not where they find value. Maybe they find value in the helping that they do in that position, and that completely blew him away. Because to him, the only way to get value or to be of value or to grow was to grow in knowledge. And so, but we do the same thing to autistic individuals. We make assumptions about what they should value based on what we think in our experiences with neurotypical populations. And then they may leave out relevant information that you need, like the fact that there's a squirrel running around studying. So some of the cognitive processing differences. So these things, yes?
From the last slide, would you touch on, unless you've got it in a different part of your talk, maybe information about self-harm, and if the individual talks about self-harm, what that really means so that they don't get sort of shuttled down the path, isn't really what they meant?
Yes. So the question was, would I touch on self-harm and discussions of self-harm, and really aggression in general, discussions of aggression, because it tends to get them sort of escalated in terms of like what people are fearing, like if they're talking about self-harm, or if they're talking about, I'm going to blow up the school, or I'm going to poison so-and-so, or I'm going to hurt myself, or I wish I wasn't here. Exploring those a little bit. So sometimes it really does mean I am in a very bad place and I am thinking about hurting myself. And that needs to be addressed in the way that you would any suicidal client. Sometimes it's, I don't have a better way of saying this. I'm anxious about something, or I'm anxious about something that's happening in school. And I don't have a way, I can't conceptualize that, I can't explain that, so it comes out as aggression or self-injury. And so trying to, and I think BCBAs are very, board-certified behavior analysts are very good at this, you're looking for always looking for what's driving something. So what happens before, what they get out of it, so that you can figure out why it's happening. So some of the things that the cognitive processing differences, so we talked about how it can contribute to symptoms. So It affects their adaptive skills. It affects their ability to come up with a plan B. It affects their ability to generalize skills. So this goes in both columns. So contributing to symptoms you're trying to treat, but also how you treat them. Parents will come to me and say, he can do this at school. Like, that's wonderful. That's not home. He can do laundry on the machines at school. That's great, but it's different at home. Same thing applies. So we teach skills. So maybe we teach them anxiety management related to tests. Doesn't mean that they can then apply that to social situations. Or we can teach them how to manage their anxiety in social interactions with a boss. Doesn't mean they can apply those same strategies to anxiety around social interactions with coworkers, because it's different in their minds. And there are some differences in how you do that. New social situations, inappropriate behavior in social settings, difficulty sort of determining how they fit into whatever situation went wrong. So all of these things can also affect our treatment. We talked about limiting generalizability of skills, attendance in sessions, implicit learning differences. We assume that somebody knows how to place an order online for groceries. We assume that somebody knows what to say when a telemarketer calls to get them off the phone. We assume that they can figure out some of these things. And so when we tell them, hey, do this, and then they don't, when we tell them, hey, why don't you switch to online grocery shopping, and they don't, then we got to take a step back and think about what might be driving that. Humor, metaphors, sarcasm in session. So sometimes I will do like an understanding check. So, what do you think about that? Or what do you think I'm saying? Just to make sure that I'm actually saying and they're interpreting it the way that I'm saying it. So emotion regulation, low frustration tolerance. So emotion regulation is also part of the executive function, sort of that same part of the brain. May not be aware of their own emotions, much less other people's. So now you're telling them, when you're anxious, what were you thinking? And they're like, when was I anxious? It's like, well, you were just anxious a minute ago when we told you that our session date was going to change next week. Oh, okay. So you may have to start by teaching different types of emotions. Like, this is anxiety. When you're anxious, you might feel this in your body. You might have this going on in your brain. There are levels. So we use something especially for younger individuals, called the Incredible 5-Point Scale, which teaches that there are levels. So it starts with like volume. There's levels for volume. And your volume in a library might be a 1. Your volume at the park might be a 5. And trying to apply that then to emotions. And then recognizing subtle escalations. Sometimes there may not be a subtle escalation. It may just go from 0 to 60. But when there is, they may not be able, so they may have trouble talking about the emotions that they're feeling. And then they may not even be aware of the thoughts that are occurring to them that may be triggering those emotions. But you think about, we'll talk a little bit about the underlying sort of rationale behind CBT, but if you think about it, you've got to be able to identify what irrational thoughts are driving your anxiety. But if you don't know when you were anxious, and you certainly don't know what you were thinking at the time, then you're going to have to back up in teaching that. The other thing that kind of falls into really all three of these categories is our assumptions. They may be getting loud, but it's not because they're angry. They may just be really excited and leaning in and really trying to communicate something that they're really excited about. But if you get kind of off put by that, or if that makes you uncomfortable, then that changes your working relationship with them. And so recognizing that their nonverbal cues to you may not always mean what you think they mean. So some general strategies that I've just kind of come across. Some of these are evidence-based in the literature, some of these are practically. So developing rapport. So I watch Hotel Transylvania so that she can be an expert in something, because I am not. I have learned about printing circuit boards. I have learned about the sequence of Marvel movies. I have learned about a lot of different things because they are the experts in those. And we spend so much time talking about me knowing stuff that they need to learn, or it can feel that way. I try not to make it feel that way. Then that we need to let them be the experts too. Because they are the experts in themselves, they're the experts in their lives, they're the experts in their restricted interests. And why should they take the time to listen to us if we don't do the same? We need to be of value to them too. Explore their goals. So we do a worksheet, or we did in the college program, we did a worksheet at the beginning of our time with the students. How do you want your professors to see you? What do you want other people, which boils down to, what do you want other people to see in you? A lot of them would say that I'm quiet, that I'm nice, that I'm smart. What is it socially? So you want to get married. So with the student that I was talking about earlier, you want to get married. What does that look like to you? You getting married, what, more specifically, what would that look like? Having friends, what would that look like? Like, how often would you get together? What kinds of things would you want to do together? Would you want to talk to them over text? Do you want to just see them every 2 weeks at a prescribed time that you don't have to plan? What does that look like? What does that goal look like? We talked about true independence is not the lack of a need for help. Validating their experience. Sometimes the awkward social interaction has nothing to do with them. The student whose roommate is digging through their trash can looking for used condoms. That is an awkward interaction. It has nothing to do with the person on the other spectrum. And then interaction styles in your sessions. This goes against pretty much everything that we are taught in, at least in psychology, in terms of clinical work. We're always taught in therapy sessions, ask open-ended questions. Every grad student comes in and they say, I asked them open-ended questions and I got a lot of I don't knows. It's like, yeah, because they probably don't know. With this group, you may have to actually revert to multiple choice questions. So sometimes what I'll do is, instead of saying, so I may start with, when you were nervous about the test, what were you thinking? So that kind of gives them, a little bit of room to think about that. But if I get back, I don't know, then I might say, well, sometimes in that situation, people are worried that they're going to fail the test. Sometimes, and that if they fail the test, then they're going to fail the class. Sometimes people are worried that they're going to fail the test and that their parents are going to be mad. Or sometimes people worry that they won't be able to, continue participating in sports if they fail this test. So do any of those, and so I kind of use what I know about the individual to offer some multiple choice, and then a lot of times they can come back, oh yeah, it was this one. So I'm not leading them to one in particular. I'm making an educated guess as to what it might be, and then letting them tell me, which is easier than generating it on their own. We talked about literal language. I like to use, for a lot of patients, not all, for a lot of patients I may use an agenda. So we're going to talk about this, this, and this, and then this is going to be the time we can talk about Marvel or anime or Hotel Transylvania or you pick. So there's a very clear expectation. This also helps sort of rein in discussions that may not necessarily be productive. It's like, that's great. Let's talk about that during whatever you call the end time. And then use visuals. I have a lot of examples of visuals that I will show. Because two things happen. One, there's a lot of stimulation happening when you are in session. So it's social, it may be anxiety provoking, it's not the most comfortable environment in terms of like, they would much rather be sitting in their bed at home. You know, there's a lot of other things going on. So if I can make it visual and then let them take it home, they can process it at a time where they may have more sort of capacity to process. Two, just because I think the connection between two things happening makes sense doesn't mean that they will. But if I can draw it so that they see it, then I can get by it. So, okay, you want this goal. So what do you have to do to get here? So you want to be a veterinarian. So this is very abstract. This requires a lot of executive function. And we can talk about it, but I want to draw it too. Because we also know that language may or may not be their strong suit. But if I can make a picture out of it, then that might help. And then they can refer back to it when I'm not there. Getting buy-in. Psychoeducation goes a long way. So for those who aren't as familiar with cognitive behavior therapy, the idea behind it is that anxiety, at least related to anxiety, anxiety is sort of a overreaction of the fight or flight response that gets triggered when it doesn't need to be triggered. And so your body will do things to prepare to fight or flee. Your brain is looking for all the ways that whatever's going to happen could kill you, because if you can anticipate it, that's a good thing. What happens is that misfires, and so now you have to tell your body to stop the heavy breathing, you know, all this stuff that it's trying to do, the heart rate, all that, and you have to change the way you're processing what's going on in your environment, the way you're thinking about things, which we call irrational thoughts. So I explained this in a bit more detail to one of the students who had some sort of compulsive tendencies around symmetry and germs and things like that. And he came back the next week and he says, I think I cured my issues with symmetry, I just didn't respond. Because he understood. He got it. He was like, I am perpetuating this by avoiding or fixing the lack of symmetry. If I don't do that, then that will get better. And now, granted, in terms of the things that made him anxious, it was really low on the total. But he got it. And then he was like, okay, I understand why we're doing this. You know, so we talked about creating a scale for how anxious he was and what kinds of things, you know, was it a really low level of anxiety versus a high level anxiety? He's like, can I use a logarithmic scale? I was like, sure. I don't care what you do. So relating constructive feedback to their goals. So I can go in and say, don't say that to this professor. Or I can go in and say, if you say this to this professor, they will not, or if you leave early because they're taking questions now and you don't have questions. That seems to be a thing. Then the professor is going to think that you're not invested in their class. And the professor is going to think that you don't care about your grade. Now, whether they should or not, whether they should make those assumptions or not, that's what they might think. And so then I'm relating not to my own values or my own judgments, but to theirs. Incorporate their restricted interests, which we talked about. And be okay with things progressing a little slower. I mean, you may have to go back and teach. This is what anxiety feels like. This is what anger feels like. This is what depression feels like. You may have to go back and teach, okay, there are levels of anxiety. You may have to then help them generate, you may spend a lot more sessions helping them generate, like, what's making me anxious in this situation? What am I worried is going to happen? And then once you get them kind of doing that in this scenario, you may have to help them apply it all over again in a new scenario. So we talked about, cognitive behavior, so that symptoms are driven by a combination of thoughts that may be irrational and behaviors that that perpetuate this, so both physiological but also like sedentary tendencies and things like that. So they may have, we talked about this, they may have difficulty reporting their own thoughts. Their irrational thoughts may be, so irrational thoughts, for those who may not have as much CBT experience, those are things that are driving whatever's, so like, for example, with anxiety, if I fail this test, then I am going to have to drop out of college. My parents won't let me move back in, and I'm going to be homeless. Irrational, probably, irrational thoughts. Their irrational thoughts may be tied up in some of their ideas around social norms. So if I don't have somebody to sit with at every meal, I am not like everyone else. Or if I need help with this, then it means everybody's going to know that I have this disability or this disorder. So two of the things, the way that I typically like to address this is by exploring what's the worst thing that could happen. Let's just get it out there. What's the worst thing that could happen that you're afraid of? And they may need some help figuring out what it is that they are actually anticipating. And then, all right, well, let's look at the evidence that will happen. So, okay, you're worried that you're going to fail the test and you're going to end up homeless. So what are the odds that you're actually going to fail the test? Okay, well, you studied. You didn't fail any of the other 3 tests in the class. You may not have studied as much as you did for those other 3 tests. Okay. So if you fail this test, though, your other 3 grades are pretty good. So kind of using that to challenge the idea that I'm going to fail this test and be homeless. You may have to, so some part of this is also behavioral activation, so getting them to go out and do stuff. But that requires sometimes social interaction. That may require really figuring out interests, and their interests may be so narrow. So it's not unusual for me to have conversations with families like, okay, we need to figure out something to reinforce this. But their interests are so narrow that it is very difficult to find. And so it may take some work, finding the things that motivate them, because that internal motivation versus external motivation is a little bit harder for all of us. And they may need more practice for things like learning to take deep breaths and things like that. So this is an example of how I might explain something like an increase in anxiety. So this is a visual that I might use. This is how I might talk about depression. So it starts with a variety of potential triggers, and then your behavior may change. You may lose, your sleep may change, your appetite may change. You may not do things that you used to enjoy. You may be more irritable with people, have trouble controlling your emotions. You may tend to ignore positive things that happen and only focus on the negative. And so this spiral And so then looking at, okay, well, so how do we bring it out? And so using visuals to really solidify some of this. We talked about teaching emotional control. Sometimes it's as simple as just giving them a strategy when you figure out what works. So for some of this, we like them to be able to generate their own thoughts. So when I'm in this situation and I'm worried about this, I can remember, all of these different things. Sometimes you just have to give them the statement. When you find whatever works, when you find what's driving it, like almost like a mantra, teaching them something specific. Reminding them that there will be an end to this emotional distress. And having a plan in place beforehand. So practicing things like relaxation strategies beforehand when you're not anxious or when you aren't angry, so that then you can implement them. And when you're going to implement them, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? So having that plan so that they don't have to come up with it in the moment, because they've already got some difficulty with planning, and now you're going to throw emotion dysregulation on top of that. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Challenging behavior has a purpose. They do it because it works for whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. And they don't have another strategy. So we can either punish or just tell them to stop, or we can replace and give them an alternative. Kind of like, negative ways of initiating interaction. It works. We all focus more on the negative. If you think about interactions we have with kids, how much we're telling them, don't do this, don't do that. The first word is no. But how often are we catching them doing something that we like? How often are we encouraging the positive? And so the negative works. It gets attention. So whatever that behavior is, looking at what it gets them. So social stories or comic strip conversations, some way to make the abstract uncertainty predictable. So you'll see like the Sparks Clinic's websites, at least they used to, I think they still do, have social stories like what to expect when you come to our building. The same thing is true for moving from high school into the community, or for moving from middle school into high school. Now, this can be done at varying levels of complexity. So maybe it's a younger child or somebody whose reading level is fairly low, and so you'd make it very simple. But then you could read it repetitively. It's in the first person, so it's them in this situation. Sometimes, sometimes I need to go to the doctor. This is what happens when I go to the doctor. So that it's very simple, but gives them an idea of what to expect. And avoiding words like always and never, because those absolutes are never the case. It can be as simple as a discussion. So for those who may be older or sort of have more cognitive skills, it may be a discussion or sort of discussion with some notes, like, so when you go to this place, here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen when you go to advising. Let's talk this through. When you go meet with vocational rehabilitation, here's what might happen. When you go to that job interview, here's what they might expect. And here's what you can expect. Teach at the University of North Carolina talks a lot about a culture of autism and creating an environment where their strengths and challenges are, the strengths are emphasized and the challenges are decreased. So setting up visual spaces so that the beginning and end are very clear, for example. So with assignments, this is what you have to do, this, this, and this. And it's all laid out visually, and then you know you're done. So there's no question about what's expected and when this is going to be done. what's going to have to happen, it's all laid out visually, and the environment around you is structured to facilitate that. So this is an example of like a structure. So we all use these things. If it is not in my calendar, I will not be there. I may have good intentions, but I will not be there. But relying on something like that isn't a crutch. This population may just need to learn to rely on those things earlier. In undergrad, I could handle my schedule without a calendar. In grad school, I could not. This was something we used in college. So this is an entire semester. But what happens in college is you go through periods where some weeks are incredibly easy. And some weeks you have 3 tests and a paper due. And if you didn't plan ahead for that, you're going to be anxious, I hope. It's about the only way you're going to get it through it, if you're a little bit anxious. So we did this. So we would take all of their syllabi and all of the assignments, and we would put them into one calendar. And then we'd go through and color code them however they wanted. Red, yellow, and orange, or red, yellow, and green seemed to be more intuitive because we all get used to the red light, green light stuff. But however they wanted to color code them. And so here you can see the green is what they determined would be easy. So they didn't really think too much of the math homework being all that complicated. The red was what they determined would be a lot. And so here, you're planning ahead, you're dealing with some of the executive dysfunction. You're also then reducing anxiety by preventing, hopefully, issues that may arise. So countering resistance. So for us, there's different types of clients that we're going to run into. So some are there because parents want them to be there. For us, they were in our college program to get support to get through college, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were motivated for some of the other goals that we might have that they needed to be motivated for in order to get through college. Some of them will come in and say, I am anxious and I want you to help me, and lay it out on the table, and they are motivated and they will do whatever you ask them to do. So one of the strategies, I am by no means an expert in motivational interviewing, but motivational interviewing really is just a way of asking them questions so that you get at what their goal is, what their perception of how things are working for them in meeting that goal, and what their plan to get to that goal is. So you're asking a lot of questions rather than, and if you do offer advice, you're like, hey, can I make a suggestion? So that you're giving them permission to, they're giving you permission to do that. And so I went to a training on motivational interviewing and found that a lot of what I was doing with the college students was really this. It's, all right, so that's your approach. So how's that working? Well, we don't know yet. All right, well, let's see. So after your first test, if that approach didn't work, would you consider trying what I'm studying? Yeah, okay, all right. And if their approach worked, no matter how off the wall I thought it was, then who am I to say you have to change it? Sometimes they would luck out. Sometimes their approach worked for them, even though I couldn't see it. So getting at how their goals, what it is that they want out of any friendships that they want to build, so that we're working towards their goals. The other thing that I've found is any kind of abstract goals may be difficult. So we may say, if you want to get a job as a video game designer, because that's a big goal, what does that look like? So if they can't imagine what that career is going to look like, then where's their motivation to pursue it? So we can do all that we want to draw out the connection between, if you want to reach this goal, here's our plan that we're coming up with together. But if they can't imagine what reaching that goal would be like, then their buy-in may not be the same. And so things like job shadowing can be very helpful. So then they can go in and say, I know what this is like. I know what it's like to work in this veterinarian's office. I know what this veterinarian does on a daily basis. And I think that would be fantastic. Or I don't want to do that because it smells bad there. So what their perception of reaching their goals would look like, and if they're having trouble envisioning that, how do we help them? And then again, I know I've harped on this, but everyone needs help. I cannot say that enough. So some of the things to keep in mind: understand their goals. They may not be the same as yours. Help them understand how their behavior is interpreted by others so that they can decide if that fits their goals. Not all awkward social interactions are because of the person with autism. When in doubt, draw. And so, like, these kinds of things in sessions, therapy rooms are great. And then they can use their phone, take a picture of it at the end. Technology. Use technology to your advantage. Be literal and consider the accuracy of your language. And don't assume. So some of the resources. So the first one is a book, Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Adults with Asperger's Syndrome. So these are a lot of different websites, resources. Smart but Scattered, looking at executive function. A lot of books by individuals on the spectrum that can help understand what your patients might be experiencing or what the students you're working with might be experiencing. For bullying, I like Confessions of a Former Bully. One of the things that, we tell kids, if you're being bullied, tell a teacher. And if you're physically being threatened, you should tell a teacher. But if they're calling you names, telling the teacher may actually make it worse. And so we talk about, this book talks about, why do bullies do that? Well, it's because they're getting something out of it too. And how do we make it so that they're not getting anything out of it? And then if it escalates, then definitely reporting it. But there are some things you can do before reporting it that might help. Temple Grandin, there's an HBO not documentary, it's a movie with, I think, Claire Danes, that talks about her life and how different her perspective is. It's a good sort of insight into how we may need to alter our assumptions and our perceptions, because we may be sort of a bridge between the autistic individual's perception and the neurotypical world's perception, and so we need to try to understand both. We may never know, we will not be able to completely understand what it is like to be autistic. But the more you talk to and interact with those on the spectrum, the more you can sort of get a sense of that. John Elder Robeson, Look Me in the Eye, great book. This one is a great book for couples, actually. So if you're doing couples counseling. So some community resources. For those who are transitioning out of high school, Project Search, Horizons, Triumph Services, Glenwood, Vocational Rehabilitation, the college program here. Others that the Regional Autism Network kind of keeps all of this information about local resources. So Organization for Autism Research has a great evidence-based website, and I love their transition materials for those transitioning out of high school, either into education, secondary education, or employment. So, questions? Yes?
What was the last reference you gave us that has the transition?
Organization for Autism Research.
Okay.
Yes. Diagnostically, no. So diagnostically, it was removed because the distinction between Asperger's and autism was your IQ and at what point you develop language. So if you were late developing language, then you would end up with a, theoretically should have ended up with an autism diagnosis, regardless of your IQ. But once people were verbally fluent, then there was some confusion as to, this autism, Asperger's. And they found when they did the studies for the newest diagnostic manual that what predicted their diagnosis actually had very little to do with their symptom presentation and more to do with who was making the diagnosis. And so they got rid of that. That said, there is a group who identifies very strongly with Asperger's, and sometimes for kids that I'm diagnosing or adolescents that I'm diagnosing, I may tell them that if they look up information about Asperger's, it might narrow the range of information that they get, because autism is a very broad range of skill sets, and Asperger's would narrow that range a little bit. So you still have ASPE communities, for example, but it is not a diagnosis that we make. Other questions? So I have some questions for you guys. So in the communities where you're working, so I know some of you are in school systems, but for those of you who are in the community, what are some barriers that you guys face when looking at sort of serving this population? Services.
Wait lists, there's a lot of wait lists, and
Yes.
of course, we're in this region where it's real rural,
Mm-hmm.
don't have the providers at all,
Mm-hmm.
now unless they come here to like your larger areas, but it's the wait list.
Yeah.
Also, identification.
Mhm.
Misdiagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
Not been diagnosed with autism, but have ADHD and combined
So we had somebody say resources and the lack thereof is a barrier to serving this population. Also, getting the correct diagnosis, misdiagnosis, education. Tell me more about that.
It's really hard getting services that an autism child needs in the school system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So getting services in the school system can be a battle.
Mental health and mental illness support.
Yes, so that's one of the things that we're working on is, there's a pot of money for funding mental health, mental illness treatments, and then there's a pot of money funding developmental disabilities treatments. And getting those two, there is now somebody who's kind of trying to walk that bridge, navigate that bridge, but getting the two groups to kind of coordinate is going to be very important. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about group work? Is it just too confusing for folks to be in the same group and do all of it?
I think it depends on the context. I think it depends on what the goal of the group. Does the group work have another goal besides just accomplishing the task? One of the things that we find is, I think it can be done in a way that is less problematic. So one of the things, so the way to start it off and make it fail is say, divide yourself up into groups, which I did. Because they can't find their own group. And then if they're not given a specific task, they might not do anything. And everyone else assumes they're lazy. But once you give them a specific task, they're great with it. So with some guidance, it's a good skill to learn. But there may need to be some guidance starting at a really young age when it can be done, like in middle school, high school. It's harder for a college professor to do. Things like teaching them how to identify roles in the group. Who has taken on an informal leadership role? How do you figure out what tasks this big group project involves? How do you figure out, or how do you decide who's taking on different tasks based on their skill sets. All of those things are implicitly learned, and if we can teach them how to navigate that, it's a great skill to have. Many of them will need that skill in jobs. Some of them may not. So that's a roundabout way of saying if it can be done correct or can be done in a productive way, it's a good skill, but it takes some explicit teaching for it to be productive. Other thoughts or last minute questions?
I have a question about specifically in like a therapeutic environment. How do you balance challenging perspective or giving the other person's perspective with validation, like works with a client who really sees trying to get that other perspective as invalidating of experience and feelings because it doesn't match.
Yeah. And I will acknowledge to them, like, you know, kind of like I've done several times, like, whether this is how they should view it or not, your behavior or not, this is how they do. And, you know, acknowledging that that doesn't always make it right. And that there are a lot of different ways that people could perceive it. There's a lot of different ways that things can be done. There's rarely any one right or wrong way. But here's how others might approach this. But it can be challenging, and sometimes I will get to a point where I'm like, all right, you try it your way. You know, I've given you the info. You do you. So. Other thoughts, questions? I didn't talk about disclosure of diagnosis much, but it is something that gets brought up a lot. I tend to sort of defer a little bit to the clients that I'm working with as to their comfort level with that. You can do something called partial disclosure where you're saying, I'm not good at these things without saying because I have autism. And so you're going into like a job interview setting, and you know, we all get asked in job interviews, what are your strengths, what are your challenges? And so you can disclose, I have these challenges without having to say I have autism. Some of them will go in and say I have autism. Some of them walk in with an autism, you know, t-shirt on. And that's up to them. So I tend to assess, kind of gauge their comfort level with it, and then look at what the benefits versus risks of disclosing. Because there are risks to disclosing. People make assumptions. What are the goals that they're trying to meet in disclosing versus not disclosing?
Is autism covered by ADA?
ADA?
Disability Act?
Yes. So technically you can't discriminate, but that doesn't mean that that going into a job interview it's not going to bias their perception of how easy or difficult you would be to work with. And so for me, I think that's a variable. I would like to think it doesn't. And there are companies that will only hire you if you have autism. Especially a lot of some of the like engineering and software, you know, companies. Any other questions? All right, well, I will turn it over to Tammy to close this out.
So this is your QR code.